All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to the channel. To yet another poetry-related couple of hours with myself and the newly published author, Columba. Welcome back, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well, yes. And we should stress self-published.
No, 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 no. It
It's
doesn't
not
matter.
I've not been picked up by Faber and Faber yet.
No, no. We've seen the great fanfare that has received this book.
There has been
So
some fair and some fanning,
yes,
but
yeah.
yeah, it's good.
Well, I mean, I would say it's more of an honor to be, gladly received by your various based fellows than it is to pass inspection under some, hackneyed out 58-year-old feminist at
Well,
HarperCollins
yeah,
or something. You know?
especially these days. I mean, you look at
Yeah.
the sort of stuff that's published by Faber or poetry today, and
Mm,
it's not great.
disgusting.
Like what was it that I posted semi recently? It was the poem of the day on poetry's website, and it was
Oh.
what lesbian porn has done for me. Uh, what was it? The women small and neat top each other like slices of Wonder Bread. But when we meet needing each other, fresh dough like with our rehearsed finger tread or
Utterly
something
inane.
utterly disgusting
It's
like
not.
that.
It's just the inanity of it. It's not. It's not even saying anything worth saying. Other
Yeah.
than
Oh, and the
me and my
author's name is
gross lesbian friends.
Destiny Birdsong.
Destiny Birdsong.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, dear God.
Yeah, it's bleak.
Yeah. Let's anyway. Moving on from that. So tell us a little bit. Do it. As I know this is very on the fly, but do a brief description or kind of promotional blurb for your new work.
Oh, for the book. Okay, well, the
Yeah.
book's called Spolia, which was a bit of just pick a title because you need something. But Spolia is so it's an archaeological term really for when you'll see a medieval building that has say a Roman column reused in the portal. And I guess part of the idea of that is a lot of our endeavors to create literature today, poetry or prose, it does feel almost like you've got all of these fragments and pieces, and people don't know quite how to put things together. I've certainly felt that way. And I think that the title was a reflection of that. Title perhaps a bit too serious for what the book actually is, because the book is light, comic, satirical stories and poems. There's 3 stories. One written in a more I mean, I've read a lot of war in the past year, so a more sort of
Mm.
pseudo war, and then the other 2 reading people like Seline, and also again
Oh,
looking at
wonderful.
was more dialogue form. They're essentially just conversation pieces. One at a party and one a guy on a date, and he gets ambushed by the girl asking him questions about Gaza. Yeah, and then the rest of it's poetry. So there's some epigrams in there because if you know me, you know I'm a big fan of Martial and
Mm.
the Roman epigrammatists, I suppose.
Yes.
I think that stuff's fantastic, and also Juvenal as well is a bit of an inspiration. Although he
Well,
wrote long form, of course.
yes. I was going to ask you, do you consider this to be a work of satire primarily?
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of
Comic.
satire in there. I think at some points it probably passes below satire into a certain um vulgarity. But that's my nature.
Well, that's just you
I'm
holding
a
up the mirror, isn't it? That's just you
It
going,
is.
well,
It
look.
really is.
I
Well, there's
mean,
that too. I mean, I'm a vulgar person writing about vulgar things. But yeah. So there's a lot of satirical stuff in there, definitely. And the
I mean,
poetry, I would say, at some points I do try to adopt the sort of Larkin-esque satirical attitude. I think
mm,
Larkin can be considered to some extent a satirist.
very much so. I think the bitch who's read nothing but witch. Uh,
Yeah, and a satire is not just of society. I'd say Larkin was also in some way a particularly poetic satirist or a satirist of poetry, but that might be a slightly different topic of discussion. But
mm.
yeah, I mean, yeah, there's some poems in there that are small comic things. Like there's a poem about taking tren. You might have money, you might have hair, you might be um, 5'10". Uh, It doesn't matter in the slightest. No, you. All right, I can't even remember my own poetry because I'm so exhausted. It's been a very, very long day. Yeah, you might have money, you might have hair, you might have taken tren. Doesn't matter in the slightest if you're only 5'10". There's stupid little things like that in there, which I think
Amusing though, very
they're
amusing.
amusing. They're amusing.
Yeah,
They're meant
and
to,
of
they're
course
meant to
there is a
delight my friends.
there's a real developed skill to that sort of thing. The
Well,
kind of the kind of
I'm glad you think so.
oh no, there is because it's something that I love writing. I mean, I was going to use the term light verse, which is not in any way to downplay it, because what light verse, because it implies a kind of frivolity,
Mm.
but there is also it doesn't imply that there's any less skill or kind of justification needed to write it, because you have to
No,
know exactly what you're doing, otherwise it's going to fall flat.
no.
Um,
There's a reason why it's always had a particularly respected position.
yeah,
That kind of writing, I think it
all the way
fills.
back to the ancient world.
Yeah, all the way back to the ancients. You even look at sort of Homer and Hesiod, they have these sort of crude, vulgar moments. Um, that's just the way of things. And I think, I can't remember if we covered this the last time we spoke, but I think particularly today in poetry, there is a place for that, or a desire for that. And I think the reason is because so many people, there's just to put it in the simplest possible way, there's such sort of ripe ground for satire.
Oh
But I
yeah,
think there's also the argument that people have this idea of poetry today is it has to be this sort of melodramatic, psychologizing thing. It has to be these poems about your sort of
my
your
lesbian lover.
yeah, my sort of my sexuality and my psyche and my
I'm
anxiety
black
and
and
my,
I'm from
my
Los
depression.
Angeles.
Yeah, yeah, or my ethnic struggles or all this sort of stuff. And I think it's just
Utterly
it.
drab. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you have to compare that as to be a sort of boil, and satire is this nice red hot little lance that can just
Mm,
poke it and pop it. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it's an area where I agree with our esteemed friend Bronze Age Pervert, because he says the same thing. There's a lot of stuff right now that is very, very flimsy and ugly and obviously terrible to everyone.
yeah,
And there's
it's a
such
weapon.
rich
It's a weapon.
yeah, and we live in times, again, we live in times of such chaos that it's very, very hard to write sort of, crystalline, pure um, literature about oh, I don't know, being on some sunless cliff cove on the Ionian Sea or something like that. It's hard to write about that when you look out your window and like Shaniqua is, like twerking away, and
It is. I
it,
think
it
it's
it's a time for satire.
it's the real dilemma, I think, of a modern writer as well. Yes, your duties to some extent is to sort of hold up the mirror and go, well, look. But the problem is that, I mean, you don't want to spend an entire career just reflecting a big pile of shit
Well,
back at your
that's true.
readers,
Yeah,
do you? I mean,
I'm hoping this isn't the culmination.
oh no,
Uh,
no. But I mean, what I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, because you've got that on the one hand, and on the other hand, as you say, there's always that slightly paranoid feeling that you're dodging it when you write, something about,
mm,
like you said, kind of the more conventional kind of romantic or kind of exotic type of lyric. I mean, you kind of feel, am I deliberately averting my eyes as such, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
yeah,
I mean,
and I think someone like Larkin was very much conscious of that. There's
mm,
the famous interview with Betjeman where he says, people accuse me of writing a sort of counsellistic kind of verse, but one can only write the kind of poetry that one can write.
yeah.
And I do think that's a very powerful argument. And you do feel silly writing about Hyperion and Helicon and the Muses. But I do think equally on the other side, we have this problem, and we talked about this in our last stream, and you know my opinions on this. We've spoken about it at length. Um, and I've tried to write articles, but my prose is terrible about the idea of good art and right wing art, and I think that the idea of right wing art is just a kind of ridiculous thing, really.
Yeah, it's
This
just
idea,
it's
this
dragging
idea
it's
of sort of
dragging an ideology into something which
yeah,
doesn't
this
need
idea of like
ideology.
based and red pilled art or whatever. It's silly. The goal should just be good art, good literature, and with satire, it's quite difficult, I suppose, because in my mind, I worry it's am I just writing? Is it
Well
basically just
they conflate. I agree with this because it's based with good. which is a very different thing. I
Yeah.
mean,
But
I've al- I the
in terms of my writing this book, I do think my worry is also, is this just an extended form of like a rambling tweet or something? Is there anything in here that approaches the condition of literature? And I think, people today seem to view anything that's bound in a book, anything written at all, as literature. But I mean, there are a lot of books published every year, thousands of them. I would say these days, very few of them could be considered literature in any meaningful sense. And so
well,
I had that on my mind all the time.
I think the duty of a poet who is also of certain opinions about the state of things, the duty is to try and raise up the diction and the discourse
Yeah,
to a
there's that
level that
too.
can be considered literature, because there's nothing at all wrong with making literature out of kind of the terrible emotions that come with realizing where one is in things. So I mean, again, it's there's nothing wrong with writing poetry that concerns that, I don't think, or writing anything that concerns that, as long as the writing talent is there to begin with. I mean,
Yeah,
I've
I
I've,
mean,
I've
this is
often
where the
said
question of
I'm a great reader of Pablo Neruda, who I think was a terrible person,
mm,
awful Marxist Stalinist type man who did lots of awful things, and yet he was a very great poet, clearly.
and this is where I suppose some people might accuse you of being worldly, because you can say, well, if you're looking at literature, not the world in general, but literature as its own sort of contained world. When you look at a poem or a story or a piece of writing, um, and this is a mindset that people need to get into if you want to get serious about literature, about art in general, is you're not looking at that piece of writing for its moral message. You're looking at, as you say, right, the the phraseology, the way that words are used, the actual the style, which is a very broad term, the metric, whatever you're talking about, the actual nuts and bolts of the writing, and the quality of the writing. And like you say, I mean, you can, or Rimbaud, French poet, again, a perfect
Mm,
example. We talked about him before. Um, some of the poems which he wrote are absolutely horrific.
yeah.
Like horrendously sort of immoral slop, just disgusting
Was
stuff.
it was it Rimbaud that wrote the drunken boat full of vomit being pulled by
Yeah,
Indians up
yeah,
a
but
river?
he wrote worse than that. I mean, he wrote a poem called I think it's called Memoirs of an Aged Cretin. I can't remember the French title, and that's a disgusting, literally a disgusting poem. I mean, even
Mm.
today.
But
But if you compare that disgusting poem to the kind of disgusting lesbian porn stuff today, you will see that in terms of technical ability and technical qualification, there are two different worlds, right? Rimbaud's work can still be considered a work of art, um, and that's the point. I mean, poetry to some extent, literature in general, poetry more acutely, I would say, is a sort of a great metric of where the actual language is at, and also like a custodian of it. Like poetry done well, some theorists have said, I think it was Matthew Arnold who said it, I'm not sure, but can essentially vivify or vitiate the language. It reinforces the language, because you sort of, it's like a sort of brushing up, to put it that way, not just for the writer but for the reader. And I do think that's a very important thing, and of course that does lead into the wider world. I mean, if art gets better, then by definition life gets better. Um,
absolutely.
and I think people need to think about that. You need to get away. It's not that you shouldn't care about morals, it's not that you shouldn't be amoral, but you need to realize that when you're dealing with art and literature, it's a different collection of metrics that you need to
Mm,
go by. Um, you know,
absolutely. I mean,
it's
it's
you can't start talking about good morals if you're trying to fix a car. I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but that's exactly the point. I mean, you need to realize that with literature, you're basically dealing with a sort of machine. You've got all these interlocking parts. It's a very complicated thing. You need to understand it. You can't just approach it through a lens of morality. The conflation of art and morality is really very wrong. It's a I mean, people say they understand it, but I don't know if they understand just how wrong it is and how much it needs to be avoided.
well. You mentioned Seline earlier on,
Mm,
and he's someone I've been reading a lot of recently.
he's so
And
funny.
well, see, because something that they have in France and in the continent, but especially in France, that we really don't have here in Britain at all, is that they have a kind of slavish admiration and tolerance for their artists, especially their writers. I mean, to the point where they almost expect them to be badly behaved in some way. You know, whether it's kind of, you know, some sort of hideous sexual peccadillo, or you know, being Seline. I mean, it's they almost kind of expect it. Now, I do think that it's kind of a give and take thing, because in Britain we have the opposite effect where we don't give a damn about writers. I mean, I've been reading a lot of William Golding as well recently, who I think is still very underrated. Most famous, of course, for Lord of the Flies, and he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, I think, in 1982, if I'm not mistaken, sometime in the 80s, and he'd heard the news that morning from a telegram, and he had some things to do that morning anyway, and he sort of came out of his house and he saw that his car had been parked illegally. He got a big ticket, and there was sort of wardens stood there, you know, sort of looking at him, going, you know, what do you do? And so he's, oh god. So he gets in the car and he drives, and he thinks, well, right, can I go straight to the local council office and pay off this parking ticket? And as he goes around the corner, there's two policemen there. And he stops and goes, "Oh, excuse me. Could you know if I can go straight to the local council office and pay this off?" And they say, "Oh no, sorry, sir, you can't do that. The council office can't have people running in and out doing parking tickets. What I recommend you get up to, sir, is that you write to the address here and you enclose a check for the £80. And I advise you park your car more carefully in future, sir. Oh, and by the way, congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize in Literature." You know, so it's a completely different atmosphere for artists in Britain.
I do wonder why that is.
I think both sides have merits and both sides have drawbacks, because, you know, it's wonderful for writers to be kind of worshipped and feted as they are in France, but then you're going to end up with characters like Sartre, you know, who are just fated well beyond their capability and their morality, I think. So, you know, and at the same time, you're going to get people here who are just ignored when they really shouldn't be.
It's an interesting question about France, because they do seem to have this sort of culture around, like, the man of letters is something that's still respected in France.
Yeah.
I do wonder why that is, and I think part of it perhaps is because French literature has always to some extent been more classicizing or formal, more academy. That might be a good term than English writing. I mean, even today they still have the was it like Institut de Langue Française or something like this, where you know they have this academical council,
Académie Française,
yeah, the Académie Française, where there's like 30 professors drawn
Yeah.
from the Sorbonne or wherever, who literally come into a sort of rococo chamber with
in their habits verts, you know, in the green outfit, you know, the
tailcoat with like
uniforms.
gold leaf on the side, and they have swords as sabers, and they preserve the, you know, the purity of the French tongue. I mean, something like that to us is just ridiculous. I mean, you know, when I first found out about this institution, it was crazy. And then again, you know, I'm going to be going to Provence next month, and I was do a lot of reading, and it turns out that actually, you know, this tendency towards these formal literary organizations in France go back a very long way. So if you look at
Indeed.
the 1300s, even after the Albigensian Crusade and the downfall of the troubadours, which is a whole other story, there's a sort of revival, a much more neutered, more orthodox, shall we say, form of writing is encouraged, and these troubadours are encouraged, and an official institute is set up called something like the Academy of the Gay Saber, you know, the gay science, which is where Nietzsche gets the title from for his book. You know, the being like the science of poetry and of singing. And this organization, which was set up in the 1300s, still exists. It's actually still around.
Wonderful.
Which well, yeah, that's the thing. But if you go on their website today,
Oh no,
you know, you'll have stuff like you know, the French will say something like, you know, empowering voices, and then you'll have a picture of, you know, like Algerian youths from the banlieue or whatever, which you know is crazy to think about what it's become. But the point is that the French have always been this sort of academizing people, and I think in a sense these institutions have sort of kept that attitude alive in France. I mean, of course, you can argue to what extent the culture influences the institutions and vice versa, but I certainly think that that's something you have to consider. It's an interesting question, an interesting aside.
Well, I think that it's all different ways of recognizing the importance of art and literature.
Mm.
I mean, I can't remember who it was. I was reading a wonderful essay about the position of the poet laureate here in Britain.
Well, that's the thing. You just get like a butt of wine, and you can write
You
whatever
get
you
you get
want.
you
It's
get
quite
you get £5,000 and a butt of sack wine, or sherry, I think.
It
But
does have a certain charm that the
well,
French
it's
institutions lack.
it is I think more fitting to hear than what the French do. I wouldn't want to replicate the French
Yeah,
letters system in Britain.
it's
It's
like
it's courses
it's
for
like a bunch
courses.
of hobbits created a
Yeah, I
poetry
mean, and
competition.
and
Yeah,
the
it's
and
very
the
British.
somebody said the main function of the position of poet laureate, because they're not required to do anything. They don't even have to technically write any poems while they're in the
Mm.
position. There's no formal requirement for them to. I don't. I believe when Ted Hughes was laureate, he wrote basically nothing. But the point is, the point of the existence of that position and the small but symbolic reward that you get for having it is that it's the state, or rather the monarch, simply recognizing that poetry exists and is important.
Mm.
You know, it's like it's yes, we acknowledge that there is such a thing as an important poet, and here's some wine.
I mean,
Sort
yeah, I
of,
mean, there is something. Of course, it does have that sort of charming British
yeah,
informality,
the
but there is,
court poet. Yeah.
yeah, but there is something very, very important about the position. And I mean, even look at the title, for instance. I mean, the poet laureate. That
Mm,
means a poet crowned with laurels,
yeah.
and that goes all the way back to the ancient world and also to the revival of poetry. The Dolce Stil Novo in Italy. You think of Petrarch, who was crowned by the sort of town priors. As a poet, crowned as a poet after I think he
Il
published
Vate.
an epic poem on Africa.
Mm.
Um, I think on the Carthaginian Wars, but I'm not sure exactly. It's in Latin. It's beyond me.
Well,
But
if
that's the
you
point. Like the poet laureate, it harks back to all of these things. And I mean, I dread to think how many people actually have those associations when they hear the title today.
no,
But
I know.
you know,
Well, to be fair,
it remains.
it's not been too bad yet. I mean, other than Duffy, it's not been awful.
Yeah,
But
I mean, who's at Armitage right now? Who I
Simon
was looking at,
Armitage,
and I
yeah,
was looking at in London, and I mean, some of his stuff
not
is
bad.
is not bad. Yeah,
Yeah, I think him and Sir Andrew Motion, who was the one before Duffy.
Larkin's
Um,
biographer. Yeah, Motion's
yeah, I
fantastic.
mean they're both talented writers. I think I appreciate Motion's poetry, but it's never really touched me in the way that other poets do. It's not,
Mm,
it's sort of like looking at a piece of art and going, yes, that's perfectly good, but it doesn't
that's it.
really,
Yeah, you're right.
it
I said
doesn't,
it before.
get you,
Mm,
like something else would. Um, I mean, something that I love about the Italians is how much status they accord to the poet.
mm,
Like as you say, Petrarch being carried through the town. I mean, a more recent example is D'Annunzio, who is kind
mm,
of heralded because I think they understand that I think without even thinking it out loud, they understand it kind of intuitively that the poet, the national, the regional, the cultural poet as a figure is your kind of crowning point culturally.
mm,
Because they are making the best of your language, of your idiom, of your expression, of your
mm,
way of life as such. And so there
yeah.
is a kind of, I mean, I
No, it's
think
absolutely true. I mean,
D'Annunzio
if you read
was being feted at like 14. He was being carried in front of like the people of his town. And they would all go, "Oh, il vate, il vate," and he would read, and they would all cheer.
But I mean, that is it. I mean, a poet can be a great sort of summing up. I mean, if you read Dante, for instance, you're not just dealing with the subject matter. I mean, Dante's poem, and again, it is hard to disentangle the exaggerations from the sort of rhetoric of the Risorgimento, because that is really, Dante was out of fashion in Italy in the late 1700s, 1500s, during the Renaissance, because he was viewed as the arch medieval poet in many ways. And especially in the Enlightenment, he fell out of favor as this sort of barbarous dark age with all these crude stories. Um, and the Risorgimento was a partially a reaction against that, but it's also because Dante can be this unifying national figure for the whole country, etc., etc. In the same way that I suppose Shakespeare is for Britain.
Mm.
So that's really, I mean, in the 1800s, you have a lot of idolization of art figures and things. I mean, a good example is the Mona Lisa, right? It was only really the 1800s that painting became what it is now, this icon.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is, to what extent can you disentangle Dante from that? But the fact does remain, if you read him, that you see it's not just a story of a man descending through hell. It's this encapsulation of the whole life of his period. There are bishops, teachers, warriors, stories. Even in the sort of astronomical side of it, he displays all of the scientific learning of his time. I mean, even when he I'm pretty sure there's even a line that refers to the fact that when he goes through to the bottom of hell and then he starts to reascend out the other side of Earth, suddenly everything turns and it's like, the gravity is on the other side. And so it's really on the cutting edge of I mean, bear in mind, Dante was reading Latin translations of all of the, Arabian polymaths and, Avicenna and people like this. You get all of that learning, which was all in ferment in Italy. You got all the cultural life, all the social life, even down to the level of sort of street brawls in Florence. You get all of that in Dante. It is the sort of summation of his period, and I think that is a great thing that a poet can do, and it used to be really, really respected. Even till recently, I think to some extent Larkin was accorded that status in Britain. He was very, sold very, very highly, or sold very, very well, very widely talked about. His poetry, people understood. It seemed to sort of sum up a whole way of living and what was happening to the country and the roots of the country as well. I mean, he wasn't just purely in modernity. Larkin wrote poems like 1914 and an Arundel Tomb, and
Mm.
there's this. He does have this wonderful way of summing up and taking everything in.
Very, very much the heir to Thomas Hardy, I think.
Oh yeah,
Larkin,
oh
in
yeah.
terms of
But
his
also,
poetry.
increasingly, I think I read a bit of Auden into some of Larkin's poems as well. Even some of his titles, like "The Less Deceived," and then you think of
Yeah.
something like Auden's "The More Loving One" and stuff like that. There's a certain, yeah, I think he drew on him as well. But yeah, anyway, I digress.
I mean, I think the status that we give to poets is quite a fascinating thing when you look at it by country. I mean, I also
Mm.
quite like. I mean, it doesn't really happen anymore, but I miss the old feuds between poets. Where
Oh yeah,
because it's a dead serious thing. If you are one, it has to be the most important thing in your life if it's a mantle you're going to take up.
yeah.
And so of course it does become a kind of cutthroat thing. I mean, you know, uh, Dante certainly had his. I mean, of course, he was heavily involved in politics before he began to write as well.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, some of that did spill over later. With kind of discussions about him. In
Oh, but
Spain,
not just even
famously,
personal stuff. I mean, you got to remember we actually have, if you get a copy of the early Italian poets by Rossetti, or you get the Canzonieri by Dante, you see that it was very common back then that you would write a sonnet, and it would be sort of read in the city, and then someone would write a response.
yeah,
And there are examples of this where, for instance, Dante asks a question in La Vita Nuova in one of his sonnets, and Guido Cavalcanti, who was a friend of Dante until, well, Dante had to exile him from the city, and then he died. But anyway, he wrote a reply answering this. I can't remember the exact details, but anyway, there are examples of this where it isn't sort of talking about love, but even from Dante, who people think of as this very stately figure at all times. There's a poem that he wrote to, was it Chino de Pastoia or da Pastoia? I can't remember exactly. Who was a poet of the period, and Dante says, you're like a bastard, you're a whore son, you're a thief. Like shits all over him. In beautiful, beautiful poetry, but shits all over him. And yeah, I mean that's always been a sort of part of the game as well. In Scotland, especially, there's a wonderful tradition in the Middle Ages called flighting, where you would
yes,
have these,
yeah, the
yeah, you'd have
battling
these
of poets.
you'd have
Yeah.
these two court poets stand in front of the king or the lord, whoever, and just swear at each other in rhyme for hours, where one would just be, you're a fucking whore son dog piece of shit. And the other one comes back, and everyone found this amazingly entertaining, going on for hundreds of years. Which perhaps says something about the Scottish character, but yeah, you need that. And like you say, I think the point about if you want to be a poet, again, I realize this more and more with sort of a certain grimness, that it does have to be. I mean, it's Eliot who says, something like great poetry is the gradual extinction of the personality.
Yeah.
And then Fry in his Anatomy of Criticism says that the lyric poet especially must become like sort of alarmingly impersonal in many ways, because when you're writing a poem even about your own feelings, in a way you're sort of taking those feelings out of yourself
You are
and objectifying yourself and your own feelings, and it requires a certain
deeply
cold
existential.
attachment to do it really well. So yeah, I mean, the more I learn about that, the more I realize that it does have to sort of be this thing that you take very, very seriously. And if you're prepared to sort of make the sacrifices required, then you must be passionate about your poetry. And if someone comes along and shits all over it and calls you a bastard, you sort
Defend
of
it.
have
Defend
to
it.
respond in kind.
Defend it like someone attacked your wife. That's
Yeah,
what it's got to be like.
literally.
I mean, you got to go. There's one of my favorite Spanish poets is Francisco de Quevedo, who had these enormous long running feuds with all kinds of authors who were attacking each other. And in fact, what's odd is that it was almost like a kind of modernist versus traditionalist feud going on, because Quevedo was this part of a school of poets who preferred almost kind of like what we would call Larkin-esque language, where it's very you're dealing with great things, but in the most kind of taciturn way that you can.
Yeah.
And he was battling against these people who enjoyed Baroque style for Baroque style's sake, if that makes sense. And there was a poet, I think it was Louis Pacheco, who they criticized each other in some letters, and then the next time that Quevedo saw him, he kind of pulled his hat off and called him a bastard. And then he saw Pacheco in a church kissing a woman, and he ran up, took his sword out, and just ran him through with his sword. He's like, "Stop criticizing my fucking poems," and ran him through and left him and he died. And of course, he wasn't even arrested. This was chalked up to, it's just the poets.
That's always the funny thing, isn't it? I mean, you'll read about when Verlaine shot Rimbaud, and it's like, okay, well, give him like a year in prison,
Yeah,
it's one of those quarrels, wasn't it?
I mean, it's it's an important thing. Sometimes it comes to blows,
Yeah, but I'll tell you another thing that I'm projecting recently. I've been talking to some people about it. I think it would be good, because we've talked before about the fact that people don't really know how to read poetry or how to listen to it, and sort of the what you want to do when you're reading it. And I think not just in the technical side, but I suppose in more ephemeral things. I mean, I made a tweet recently talking about if you try and go to a poetry reading today in some local cafe or part of the university or whatever, it will be incredibly twee. You'll see things like, come along for some coffee and nibbles whilst we read The Wasteland.
To be fair, I would go to that. That's quite fun.
Well, yeah. But you know what I mean? It's totally, it totally just doesn't work. If you're in some sort of bleak university school building or some little cafe with IKEA furniture, and you're trying to read these sort of stately
Where's your
works.
Tapestries? Where's your decoration? Where's your gravity to this?
Again, if you read about someone like Stefan, well, I say George, but it's Georg, I think, in the German, but which sounds just silly. Or Mallarmé, who was sort of when he was young, George hung out with him in Paris. At his readings at his house, which I think took place every Tuesday, they would put red paper or red cloth over all the lamps. They would close all the shutters. It was sort of, and then they intoned these poems. It was this very sort of serious, mystical thing that they were doing. And George eventually, in his house when he was older, and he had this cult, he had this room which he called the Globe Room, And if you wanted to enter it, you had to sort of take off your three-piece suit and put on like a toga and sandals and
Stands out.
all of this. Yeah, all of
It's like
this is
going into a mosque.
yeah. Well, yeah, it's like going into a Greek temple or something. But that in and of itself, I mean, people will probably just scream like LARP or whatever. But at the end of the day, that shows the sort of status that poetry has. I mean, I can't remember. I think it was Pound who wrote that a good yeah, in Troubadours, Psychology in the Troubadours, an essay that he wrote. I think it's that. He said a poem is a kind of ritual. If it's kind of, guess the best way to look at it is if you have a collection of magic words, a spell, all right. And writing has always been related to magic. I mean, the word spell, right?
Yeah.
Spell out. But if you have those words but you don't read them correctly, then the magic will not work. And I think a poem is very much in the same vein. If you're some 13-year-old in a comprehensive school and you're flippantly reading The Wasteland, you're just going to say, "This is boring," fuck this, like this is shit. Like,
well, I think
you
there's
don't get it.
there's been an issue which has been going on kind of since the advent of television and radio, I think, where the speed at which people want to be gratified has gotten much quicker. So, like, I mean, a lot of people I know on the dissident right who supposedly are supposed to adore traditional arts and Western sort of civilization, this sort of thing. They haven't got the patience to sit down and read a poem, let alone a whole book.
Yeah.
Because the gratification isn't quick enough, because it actually means they have to sit down and consider each word individually and maybe read it over again and try and get an understanding of what a poet is actually doing, and it's sort of like, oh, it's too much effort, can't be bothered.
You see, I've been thinking about this recently. This point, it is totally right, and I think it's good that people are starting to sort of really attack this and say, you have to work a little bit harder. People's attention spans are very poor. You need to give your undivided attention to a poem or a piece of music. And I'm terrible with listening to music. That's what I have to add. I've got the time, and it's never been my forte, but. Carl Respector bullies me into listening to it, and But anyway, these things demand your attention, but it's not just attention, and this is something that I've been realizing more and more recently, and it's a difficult problem. And again, this guy Northrop Frye in this book Anatomy of Criticism, which I would recommend to anyone listening, it's a great book.
His book
Yeah,
on Shakespeare as well. It's very good.
Yeah. I think he wrote a book on Eliot as well, and he wrote a book on Blake. But anyway, he talks about the fact that there are all sorts of he talks about literature essentially being this big machine of interlocking signs. It's this world of signs. Again, I tweeted about this recently. A good example, I think it's the example that he gives, I'm not sure, but Agamemnon, right? The name Agamemnon. To the vast majority of readers today, even people who are supposedly into poetry, right, which means being into like Rupi Kaur or something, the name Agamemnon means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. But if you're the average educated man or woman from say 1900 and you read the name Agamemnon, you think, king of the Greeks in Troy, sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia, is betrayed by his wife on return to Greece, his brother is Menelaus, whose wife Helen is stolen away. He has his famous feud with Achilles, which is the subject of the Iliad. You have all of these. You have this whole complex of associations, right, around just that one word, and each of these words, each word is a tool which a poet can use. And in a world where no one understands the meaning of Agamemnon and no one has that complex of associations, the word is no longer a tool that can be used by a poet for a wide audience. You could perhaps for a small circle of sort of learned friends, it will work, but for the vast majority of people, it will not work. And we are progressively losing all of these touchstones, and there are many people, and again, nice guys, many people on the online right who are based, and again, they're nice guys, they have the right opinions politically, a lot of them know far more about politics than you or I assume.
Oh yeah.
Or economics or whatever. But if you sit them down with a great work of art, they might give it a really fair crack, right? And they might give it their undivided attention. But if they don't have what people used to call culture, right? If they're not a cultured person, which doesn't make them a bad person, But if they don't have culture, then no matter how much attention they give the work, they're only going to ever get a sort of retarded appreciation of it.
Yeah, they
And
appreciate it
that,
because they think they should appreciate it.
yeah, well, there's that too. But I mean, it's like they're literally incapable, because these things which the poet writing the work intended to work upon somebody, to throw up these images and these associations during the reading of it, simply do not work. They don't
Although
take effect.
I would say there is something, an idea that the late Sir Geoffrey Hill once said in an interview, which is that, well, of course, poetry has to be difficult in general because, humans are difficult. Communication is difficult. Language is a difficult thing. They're if we simplify everything, well, that's how you end up with, Rupi Kaur, etc.
Mm.
But he also said that, well, if you give somebody the wasteland who's not seen it before, one thing they have now that they didn't have back in the day that may somewhat mitigate this is, of course, that you have the internet. And I'm not just trying to be flippant here. I do think that does really make a difference because, in a sense, you're no longer, like, if you don't have immediate access to T.S. Eliot's library, you've still got a very, very good chance of
Well, I mean, this is true, but I
working
mean,
out the illusions. I mean, there is something there, isn't there?
I mean, I've heard this before. I mean, I think you mentioned this quote to me when we met in London one time, and I agree with it. But my point is that that's basically just another way of saying that if you want to appreciate the poem, you have to educate yourself, right? And if you're educating yourself as you go through by googling every word you don't understand, fair enough. That's, it's better than nothing. You're doing it. You're gonna understand it. But I think when it comes to the writing of poetry, it's, I mean, it's hard enough to read it, but if you're trying to write something, you don't have this sort of civilization, this net of associations and things that you can rely on, then it becomes a very, very difficult craft. And I think that's one reason why I do admire someone like Philip Larkin so much, is because his poetry, it was at that time, 1950s, 1960s, where really that stuff was starting to die off. And there are references to it in his work occasionally. There are some classic references and things very occasionally. But he manages to approach the sublime. He does still manage it through just purity of language. But even then, something like Larkin's language, which was considered, I mean, comically, it was considered pared down in the 50s and 60s, for a generation raised on Eliot and Pound and that really sort of cerebral classic poetry. Something like Larkin does read very, very pared down. But if you compare Larkin's writing to the average level of poetry or prose today, it's much more complex, much more sophisticated. If somebody spoke like that today, we would say, you're a Jacob Rees-Mogg, you're a sort of man out of time, you're a LARPer or whatever. And again, when you lose complexity of language, you lose complexity of thought. And so poetry can't but be more and more simple, ever more reliant on vulgarities, crudities, things that everyone can understand. And so poetry will become less difficult. If by difficult you mean complex, because people are becoming less complex. And it's a very difficult thing. And like I say, I think if it is possible, if it's true that poetry can sort of strengthen the language, then that needs to be sort of one of the goals in the manifesto. And I think education is incredibly important as well. I think without an educated society, poetry will die.
Well, I think it's not so much the
obvious.
educate, because I mean, if you think of a time like, for example, when Dante was writing, I mean, he couldn't even. I mean, the crowd of people who were actually able to read and to copy and to consider his poems was very small. But I think the problem is less with education than it is with cultural understanding, as you say, because I mean, one of the things that people don't seem to
But with
realize.
Dante, I mean, well, I'm talking about sort of on a national level. The idea
Yeah,
of having a sort of poet laureate, having poetry as this major current in a large society, that is something that dies off once you lose that level of education across the
yeah.
board. Of course, but in Dante's day, I mean, the vast majority of peasants, I think, wouldn't have understood a hell of a lot of that poem. Even the religious stuff. I mean, the average peasant had a very simple understanding of religion, not incorrect necessarily, but when Dante is going into talking about the spheres of the heaven and the science of his day and all of these complexities, he talks about, law. There's a lot of legal stuff. The average peasant would have been mystified by this stuff.
Yes, but the I think the importance is in the not so much in the formal education, but in the cultural understanding. Just because poetry, I mean, if you think about someone who wants to become a physicist, right? They have to learn the entire world, or even, I mean, probably now it'd be the world understanding of what physics is, and everything that's happened up to their very day, before they can begin to advance their own understanding, right? They have to spend a long time considering what's already happened. And I think that poetry is exactly the same. You've got to understand the culture you come from. That's why, the traditional education takes you all the way back to the ancient world, and you're versed heavily in classic texts, because it's like putting 2 points on a line. It's how much scope and how much understanding can you get in order to then build something on top of that. This is why poets and writers have to be widely read. It's because they have to understand what's come before them and what they're about to try and build on top of. So I think that you can only have, say, a Rupi Kaur if you have somebody who is one, I mean, culturally and ethnically completely removed from the Western canon, and also just somebody who's never bothered to look into it themselves, someone who's never tried to educate themselves or tried to read the classics or even any real recent verse at all by the looks of it. I mean, I don't think that is a person with any understanding of what poetry is, beyond some words that sound vaguely important.
Yeah, I think all poets make allowances for a certain kind of inspiration. I mean, I think it was Frost who did argue against this idea of, you having to have read everyone who comes before you. I do think you can stumble across something which works, something which is new in the sense that Eliot and Pound meant, literature is news that stays news. But yeah, broadly, you're right. I mean, you need that education. But anyway, I think we totally got off of how we got onto this, because I was going to say, you have all these sort of twee poetry readings going on. My projected plan is to, perhaps in London, when I'm back from Provence, which will be my jaunt for all of April, I'd like to do a sort of proper reading, perhaps in one of the old nice pubs in London. We book the place or rent the place out or whatever, and just bring people along and read some of the classics, read them properly, have a few drinks, in the tradition of sort of the Rhymers Club and things like that, which
should be a lot of alcohol. That's always a good
there would naturally be a lot of alcohol, and I think it would also be a good opportunity, of course, start by reading some Eliot, reading some Pound, perhaps some of the crowd pleasers. I mean, the Seafarer by Pound is fantastic. May I for my own self songs truth reckon, journeys jargon. How I in hardship.
Bit of Azura.
Yeah, or with Azura.
Blindstein with a cigar.
Yeah, and then I think it would be good to I could perhaps read one of my pieces of doggerel. You could respond with something better. Perhaps we could get some of the Zoomers, the sensitive young men, the basket weaver type. Somebody could read something. If it's terrible, we beat them up.
I like the idea that we make it a bit raucous. It's got to be a bit rowdy.
It has to be raucous.
We need to hire some massive heavy to be like the security with a big stick. I was reading about but
I can imagine you in like a black North Face jacket with an earpiece. Sorry,
no,
Mike,
but I'm on the. I'm going to be reading. I can't be security and reading. But anyway, I was reading Boswell's Life of Johnson. And he talks about when Johnson's play Irene was being staged by David Garrick in Drury Lane, I think.
And he was like the most famous actor of his day, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge thing.
I think Bogart painted him.
Well, he said that because it was still a relative innovation to have women on the stage. Yeah. There would be these two enormous men with huge 8-foot-long sticks stood at the front of the stage. And they would any so-and-so who wandered in, because very often these men weren't trying to be disruptive. They genuinely thought that a woman on the stage in her stockings
would be
was
ravished.
was 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 there to be picked up or to be negotiated with. So
Yeah.
these men would kind of, I mean, because of course, some scrawny Londoner coming in, and there's this enormous, 8 foot beast there. He would just literally pick them up by the coat and throw them out during the play. While all these men were trying to get up on the stage to negotiate with the actresses.
Yeah,
Um,
you need some raucous stuff. I mean, I learned, of course, Johnson drank there. It's one of my favorite
yeah,
London pubs. The ye old Cheshire
the old
cheese,
Cheshire cheese,
the
yeah,
old
Johnson and
Cheshire cheese.
Chesterton and all these, yeah,
Um,
the great men of Fleet Street all drank there.
yeah, I mean Lionel Johnson, who wrote The Dark Angel, he died after falling off of a stool in
That's
the
the way to
Cheshire
go.
cheese.
That's the way to go. One day.
Um, and then you read some of the stories of the modernists Pound when he would attend these sort of meetings in pubs and cafes. I mean, shortly before Pound left London for Paris, somebody literally tried to stab him. I mean, somebody just ran at him with a knife. I think
The ghost of Quevedo. There you go. Trying to run him through.
I think he was saved by like Aldington or something. But
Oh,
again, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, where like if you take poetry seriously, these things are sort of bound to happen. If you
we
take art seriously, and there is that sort of pride which I think artists must have, going all the way back to, I mean, if you look at the artists, the painters, sculptors, architects in Florence, in Renaissance Florence, they were ruthless, brutal critics of each other. They were constantly taking each other to court,
oh they
accusing each
were.
other of being sodomites,
Yeah.
pederasts.
Plagiarists.
And don't get me wrong, like 50% of cases they were probably right, but yeah, that's sort of that's the way it has always
We've
been, and this sort of molly cuddling twee mental health awareness poetry reading stuff that needs to stop. I mean, I want people to turn up to this and say, Columba, you're a piece of shit, your poetry sucks, and then I can just attack.
and there'll be a proper like blowout in the street then. It'll be
Proper
great.
brawl, yeah. So yeah, that will hopefully be happening
Oh, we've
sometime
got
in
to do
May.
it. I want, right. I can see we've got this like Bowden-esque sort of pub room, and we've got to decorate. I want two giant Dadaist signs on either side of the stage.
Yeah.
One says it is forbidden not to drink, and the other one says it is forbidden not to smoke. We need to have things like that. It's just,
Those are good. I'll tell you another thing. Recently, when I was in London, I went to the Historic, which is this gallery in Islington. It was first time in Islington, actually. I was not impressed, but anyway, it's a sorry.
Not what it used to be, Islington.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just.
But,
If you hear a noise, I've had some. I got some champagne for free, a gift off a client, and I'm just popping open the second one. So there's a bit of. Hang on.
I'm just drinking many coffees. But
oh god, here it goes. Here it goes. Oh fuck! God, the other one barely did anything. That would have taken a head off. Right. Anyway, sorry,
I was at this gallery in Islington.
Yeah,
and it was a collection of sort of early futurist, early 20th century, mostly Italian art. And you had stuff like the these prints with words from Marinetti's was like Zang Tum Tum, which was his onomatopoeic like gibberish futurist poem, which literally just nothing but like Zang Tum Pow.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they had copies of the futurist cookbook for sale, and I was leafing through it.
Brilliant.
And some of the recipes are just absolutely amazing. It's like you sort of drink petrol whilst eating a canapé, whilst someone gently strokes your sort of left big toe, or just these bizarre things. And what I would like is sort of bizarre Marinetti foods, futurist foods.
If you wait till
we need to work in some sort of pun to do with like marinated as well.
If you wait till my estate is sorted this summer, I will happily bankroll this entire thing. I mean, like we'll bring in cooks. We'll have like the Marinetti menu being brought out. We'll beat people who aren't paying attention.
I'm talking like marinated cogs. That'll be one dish. It's just metal cogs in a sort of lovely jus or something.
The tits ice cream, the Marinetti with the cherries.
All these, yeah, like Vril and Kippers, like.
We'll do it. We'll do it. It'll be brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, again, you sort of need stuff like this. I mean, there have been these interesting things been going on recently in London by certain people who I've met. I think they're on Twitter. They're called The Base Creates, where they've been staging plays and poetry readings. I went to their performance of Faust in St Bartholomew's Church in
Brilliant.
London, and it was an interesting thing. It was pretty fun. It was lots of interesting people there. There was a talk by what's his name, the critic writer Sebastian. I can't remember his surname. I apologize. But yeah, it was pretty good. It's sort of encouraging to see things like that happening, and to also because I being my gregarious self, like dragged everyone to the pub after it, and just talking to the kind of people who came. There were people who politically weren't total normies. They certainly weren't leftists. They were people who you could agree with politically and socially as well, and transgender issues, all this sort of stuff. But one didn't want to talk about stuff like
No, you
that
don't
with
want to
them. You
sully
want,
it with like, politics.
yeah, yeah.
If
You
they're
could talk. You
capable
could
of
talk with
taking
them.
in good art, they should be there. I think
Yeah,
is the
you
baseline.
could talk about art. You could talk about culture. You could talk about your poems. Oh, you're doing an exhibition. You're a painter, etc. All these sort of interesting people, and it wasn't just let's just talk. Let's just sit around and talk about how much we hate the Zionists, or let's talk about the Great Replacement or whatever. It was something that was sort of dedicated to art, and not this sort of festival of pessimism. And I think that a reading such as I would like to organize would have a similar ethos or a similar spirit.
Mm,
We're here for the poetry. You can leave your sort of based and red pill talking points at the door. Or
absolutely.
just inside the door over a drink, but the poetry takes precedence here. Um, that's I think would be a healthy contribution. Again, it's not to neglect the political side of things, but it's just to say that I mean I certainly don't have any energy for it. I have my eyes set on other things now. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, to be honest, it's just too much fun not to attempt it. I mean, we may as well do it while we're young,
I mean, again,
Um,
you look at your competition. I mean, if I type in poetry readings near me, I shit you not, the first thing that comes up is a place called the KWEER Cafe, the Queer Cafe.
oh God,
It was the first thing that will come up, and they'll be doing reading. It was so funny. And there was another one which was sponsored by the university, taking place at a cafe near the campus, with university money. I don't know, and it was we're going to be exploring the work of the 2020 winner of the T.S. Eliot Prize with her
oh,
award-winning
oh no,
collection
no,
Canto instead of
yeah,
Canto, which is a collection of butch lesbian subculture poetry. And this is winning the T.S. Eliot Prize, and this is the stuff that the students are meant to be reciting. And you can go along and of course get your tea and nibbles, and listen to a sort of fat people with blue hair and weirdos who smell sort of sit there and pat each other and talk about their feelings and how their feelings respond to this. I mean, that's the competition right now. That really is the competition for poetry readings. Either
oh yeah,
that or
man,
some sort of
we cause a riot.
well, it's either that or some sort of stale, telegraph adjacent, some palsied old step taker, as Larkin calls him. Come out and talk about, I don't know, how Tennyson is all about our great island story, and how Tennyson, they were building back better, and all this sort of just
Ladies and
like
gentlemen, Dr. Simon Heffer.
all this sort of drivel. And I just want something with a bit of fucking life in it, and it just doesn't seem to be
Do it,
available.
man.
So
I mean,
we're gonna have
just
to take it in hand.
that crowd we had at the exhibition last
Yeah,
July. We're going to
yeah,
if we get those people in a room to do this, it would be the best night ever. It would be
be fun.
brilliant.
And everyone has to dress properly as well. I'm gonna go to the barber. I'm gonna get the most Poundian coiffure. It's gonna be about 2 foot tall. I'm gonna have one of those shirts with a really really broad collar, and a giant knife, a giant zombie knife.
Everyone's got to be armed.
I certainly will not be going unarmed.
I'm just gonna wear white tie the entire thing
I
and
might
just
just invite Mizzy.
that would actually be quite fun. I reckon Mizzy would sort of get into it.
Yeah. Mizzy, you're gonna read The Charge of the Light Brigade.
Mizzy, we need you to do Hyperion. Do you mind stepping in? Can you just get up on
I mean, I'm sorry. I think that if I made that a ticketed event, people would come. Mizzy reading Hyperion.
Brilliant.
Mizzy reads from Hyperion. I mean, that
would. I mean, this is the sort of thing we should just
Mizzy,
be doing
if you're listening to this.
Yeah, Mizzy, if you're a regular viewer of Panama Hat Channel, then please send me an email and we'll arrange a reading for you.
But anyway, more to come on that. Hopefully, I mean, it won't be something like terribly formal. It definitely won't be ticketed because I'm not one for formality. You know, it will be. I'm gonna get some sort of room in an old nice pub in London someday in May, and it's just gonna be if you come along. You say you're here for it, you can come upstairs. Ideally, I want the room to be absolutely jam-packed full of people. I want it to be spilling out down the hallway.
Barely anyone able to move in there.
Yeah.
I reckon we should hype it quite a bit though before
absolutely.
We should go all out. Just like everyone's got to come to this. If you're not anybody if you don't come to this.
Yeah, there will be promotional materials. Things are in the works. I mean, you know, I'm a Scot, so I'm not very good at things like this, like basic organization. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. But anyway, what else should we ramble on about? Buy my book.
Yes, buy Columba's book. What name is it published under again? Sorry,
Colm Kill, which is just the another way of saying Columba. It's like the Gaelic way of saying Columba. I basically just needed a name to publish it under on Amazon. But it's the pinned tweet on my Twitter account, Columba_1. So if you fancy supporting a poet, then buy a copy. But I think we were going to talk more about you know, satirical verse and sort of comic verse. I was going to ask you you know, who have you been reading in that vein recently? What have you been enjoying?
I mean, it's not quite satirical, maybe, but it is comic. And this might be another one to bring up. But I've been recently reading a lot of Edward Lear, the great nonsense poet. Because I mean, I've been reading Lear since I was able to read. Basically,
wait, he's not the one who wrote like Jabberwocky or whatever.
No, that was Lewis Carroll did Jabberwocky. Yeah, but it's in that vein. In fact, I got started on it because I did a kind of rereading through of all of Carroll's work.
There you go.
And I find it fascinating how the real trick to good kind of surrealist stuff is not to just do away with logic. It's to establish a really bizarre form of logic and then stick to that rigidly, like to the expense of everything else. Because I mean, one of the things I love about that sort of stuff, the sort of, you know, Alice in Wonderland and everything, is that it's so British in a really sort of Victorian Edwardian way, because, you know, there's absolutely no sense of anything beyond everyone's worried about being late for tea. You know, and all this stuff about time and you know, and placement and all this. I mean, you've got to furrow some kind of internal logic and stick to that. But yes, Edward Lear.
That's a very good point though, because I mean, you know, even going all the way back to Shakespeare's plays or ancient Greek plays, there is always, you know, with comedy, it starts off with some sort of absurd rule or absurd law that people are following. Right, and you know, if you read someone like War, for instance, as you say, there is a logic which runs through the work in terms of a corrupt society or whatever, which is absurd, but it is a logic, because that's how absurd things work. I mean, if you look at our society today, there are so many absurdities, but there is this kind of ridiculous rationale behind it, and if you understand that, it makes it even funnier. But anyway, Edward Lear.
Well, actually, I just to quickly go back to Carroll there, because I realized there's something I meant to mention, is that an exercise that I like to give to people who are sort of, especially if you're trying to learn a traditional, very condensed form like a sonnet, is write a sonnet of utter nonsense. Like the word, you know, don't the words next to each other, they don't mean anything, but make it to just do that to learn the metric and to learn the syllables and everything, and make it sound as if it means something, even though it doesn't. Because very often a sense people lack and they don't realize, and it's one of the most important poetic senses, is just word music. It's just having words bounce off each other and collide with each other in a way that just sounds pleasing to the ear. And of course, Lewis Carroll was a master of this. You know, I mean, he you know, 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogroves and the mome rats outgrabe. Do
I
you
mean,
know
that's good.
when I was a kid? You're gonna like this. I assumed for a long time actually, until like several years ago, that it was written in Scots. I genuinely thought that was a Scot. I thought it was all Scots words. I
That's a
just
fair
assumed it
assumption
was.
to make.
Well,
But
because I think someone told me that brillig is like Scotch for 4 o'clock when everyone starts boiling stuff for tea. So the idea is again, this is complete bollocks, but the idea is that you'd walk through like a village in the Highlands of Scotland, and at 4 o'clock there'd be like steam and smoke and fog everywhere because everyone was like putting the cake on for tea or something. It was brillig. It was tea time.
and then I mean that kind of style can sort of turn into real art. I mean, if you think of the most respected figures in poetry in the past 100 years, I mean, Eliot, for instance, wrote stuff like Sweeney Among the Nightingales and stuff
Yeah.
like, of course, Old Possum's Book of
Yeah.
Practical Cats, which a lot of it is just absolute
Oh,
gibberish, but
I've got
it's
some. I've got the Folio Society Book of Humorous Verse in front of me. Brilliant volume, lovely illustrations in it as well, and it's got several of the T.S. Eliot cat poems, which are just great.
I was gazing longingly into a bookshop nearby. I was walking past the other day because they had I think it was a first edition of Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats in the window, and I was just staring at first or a second edition anyway.
If I was working for Faber, I'd be bowing down and thanking Andrew Lloyd Webber every day because Faber and Faber, 90% of their yearly income is just Cats royalties. It really is, like, because of course they own the right of the book.
Yeah.
And Lloyd Webber bought it off them for a fixed percentage. Yeah, sorry.
Adjacent to this, very funny. When I was in London very recently, I went to Russell Square. I saw the old Faber building and sort of paid my respect.
Yeah.
And then I went to there's a sort of restaurant cafe in Russell Square. It's not bad actually. This little Italian place called Tropea, I think. And I had my tiramisu and my little spinach cake and stuff. It was nice. It was proper. But anyway, walking through the square, there was like a sort of group of communist students meeting, and I walked past them, told them to get a job, and I went up to this I went up to this this sort of information plaque they had in the middle of the park of all the famous people who had lived and worked in Russell Square. And of course T.S. Eliot was on it, and I shit you not, absolutely serious, the text next to it said, the famous modernist poet T.S. Eliot, most famous for his book of poems, which was adapted into the musical Cats, lived and worked here from whenever to whenever. So it's so funny. Literally, that is the only thing that they saw fit to mention.
The terrible thing is they're probably right. That is actually probably the most famous T.S. Eliot work of all time. Is the lyrics to Cats. I mean, it really is.
But no, but that sort of stuff, the nonsense stuff, it is interesting because you do get into a sort of arcane space, because there is an idea in poetry of you can put words together in a sentence that might not mean anything in the strict sense of what does this sentence say, what is it trying to tell me. But again, if you look at the sort of ideas that were developed during imagism with Pound and stuff, and I talked earlier on about how Agamemnon has this whole complex of associations, right? If you might have a sentence that doesn't really mean anything, whole poem that doesn't really mean anything, but in a strict sense, but when you have all these associations thrown at you with this musical language, then the poem does take on, a purpose. It's almost like what is it? Pound talks about like a kinema, cinema, a moving thing, this sequence of images flashing in front of your eye when you read it really attentively. And it is an artistic experience. It can be a sublime experience, and I think you get that. That's the sort of thing that Eliot was trying to achieve with something like Sweeney Among the Nightingales, which actually should we read that?
Oh yeah, we have to do some readings. We're an hour in and we haven't done readings yet.
let me find it. Yeah. So
Yeah, brilliant
I'll
stuff.
read this quickly. I'm not going to attempt the Greek at the start, unfortunately.
That's all right.
Sweeney Among the Nightingales by T.S. Eliot. Ape-necked Sweeney spread his knees, letting his arms hang down to laugh. The zebra stripes along his jaw, swelling to maculate giraffe. The circles of the stormy moon slide westward toward the river Plate. Death and the raven drift above, and Sweeney guards the horned gate. Gloomy Orion and the dog are veiled, and hush the shrunken seas. The person in the Spanish cape tries to sit on Sweeney's knees, slips and pulls the tablecloth, overturns a coffee cup. Reorganized upon the floor, she yawns and draws a stocking up. The silent man in mocha brown sprawls at the windowsill and gapes. The waiter brings in oranges, banana figs, and hothouse grapes. The silent vertebrate in brown contracts and concentrates, withdraws. Rachel, nay Rabinovich, tears at the grapes with murderous paws. She and the lady in the cape are suspect, thought to be in league. Therefore, the man with heavy eyes declines the gambit, shows fatigue, leaves the room and reappears outside the window, leaning in. Branches of wisteria circumscribe a golden grin. The host with someone indistinct converses at the door apart. The nightingales are singing near the convent of the Sacred Heart, and sang within the bloody wood when Agamemnon cried aloud, and let their liquid siftings fall to stain the stiff dishonored shroud. Now, if I were to ask someone, what does that poem mean? You're gonna have a very difficult time answering the question.
Tricky,
No
isn't
one,
it?
no one listening to that and taking it seriously, no one being honest with themselves, can say that that isn't a very, very good poem, a wonderfully good poem.
Well, Eliot was such a
It's
master of
nonsense in many ways.
metric and word music, wasn't he? I mean,
Mm.
that's very evident in the cat poems as well. You know, just the way that
McCavity
words
the
are jammed
mystery
together.
cat.
McCavity, Skimble Shanks.
McCavity, the master of depravity.
Can I quickly read Busterford Jones, The Cat About Town?
Yeah, please.
And again by Eliot, and then we'll continue on about the discussion about Eliot because it's worth it.
Well,
actually,
Lear,
maybe
wasn't it? Lear.
maybe could do. Oh yeah, we need to get to Lear at some point. But I could do Skimbleshanks as well. I don't know
leave
which
it to
one.
you.
We'll do Busterford Jones. It's quite funny. Busterford Jones, The Cat About Town. Busterford Jones is not skin and bones. In fact, he's remarkably fat. He doesn't haunt pubs. He has 8 or 9 clubs, for he's the St. James Street cat. He's the cat we all greet as he walks down the street in his coat of fastidious black. No commonplace mousers of such well-cut trousers or such an impeccable back. In the whole of St. James, the smartest of names is the name of this Brummel of cats. And we're all of us proud to be nodded or bowed to by Busterford Jones in white spats. His visits are occasional to the senior educational, and it is against the rules for any one cat to belong to both that and the joint superior schools. For a similar reason, when game is in season, he's not found at Fox's but Blimp's, but he's frequently seen at the gay stage and screen, which is famous for winkles and shrimps. In the season of venison, he gives his Benson to the pot hunter's succulent bones, and just before noon, not a moment too soon, to drop in for a drink at the Drones. When he's seen in a hurry, there's probably curry at the Siamese or at the Glutton. If he looks full of gloom, then he's lunched at the Tomb on cabbage, rice pudding, and mutton. So much in this way passes Busterford's day at one club or another he's found. It can be no surprise that under our eyes he's grown unmistakably round. He's a 25-pounder, or I am a bounder, and he's putting on weight every day. But he's so well preserved because he's observed all his life a routine, so he'd say. Or to put it in rhyme, I shall last out my time. It is the word for this stoutest of cats. It must and it shall be springing pall mall while Busterford Jones wears white spats. I mean, it's not about anything. It's just
ridiculous.
Brilliant.
It's difficult to do. I mean, it's a brilliant piece of writing. It really is.
It is. It is just the ear Eliot had for the way again, because it's all really about the kind of like the raconteur London club life, really. You know, I mean, all the name dropping and luncheons, endless luncheons.
A life that still exists in a certain strange latter days form.
Yeah, but it's all for like the Michael Goves now. That's it.
Well,
Depressing.
I'd say they were always the Michael Goves, to be honest with
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Oh, but yes. Oh,
But anyway, Lear, I want to hear what you have to say about this
Lear.
band.
So Edward Lear, for anyone who doesn't know, quite a notable Victorian illustrator and nonsense poet, who could be credited with inventing the limerick, though they weren't called that in his time. I'm just trying to. I've got some notes on him here. Let's see what he actually called them.
Well, wait,
But
Lear was the one who did the really comic caricatures of the poets and things, wasn't he? Or is that another
he
guy?
was. He's got brilliant
Mm.
caricatures. I mean, he was constantly drawing very funny things. I think he just called them nonsenses. But I mean, basically, he established a pattern, and a typical Lear nonsense goes like this. There was a young person of Smyrna whose grandmother threatened to burn her. But she seized the cat and said, "Granny, burn that, you incongruous old woman of Smyrna." I'll just read a few of these so people get the gist of how they're set up. There was an old man of Peru who never knew what he should do. So he tore off his hair and behaved like a bear, that intrinsic old man of Peru. There was a young lady in white who looked out at the depths of the night. But the birds of the air filled her heart with despair and oppressed that young lady in white. There was an old person of Gretna who rushed down the crater of Etna. When they said, "Is it hot?" he replied, "No, it's not, that mendacious old person of Gretna." So basically, that's the sort of stuff. It establishes that there was a so and so of somewhere.
Yeah.
There's some incident they get involved in, and it ends with some kind of word to describe them after what's happened.
I mean, there's another very similar form. You have the Cleriu, which was designed by Edmund Cleriu Bentley.
Cleriu Bentley, yeah, a friend of Chesterton.
Yeah, and I think it's like the name has to, like, you always begin the first line with someone's name. The next line has to
Wren said,
so Christopher Wren said, "I'm going to dine with some men." Yeah, if anyone calls, say I'm designing St. Paul's. And the meter is deliberately terrible. Right?
Yeah,
like there's no meter. That's part of the comedy. But yeah, all these things are fantastic, and I always liked such a pleasure.
My favorite was always Sir Humphrey Davy abominated gravy. He lived in the odium of having discovered sodium. But yeah, it's these kind of wonderfully entertaining verses. But of course, with Edward Lear, you start off, this nice sort of funny, sort of humorous, quite quaint limerick. And something that really got to me as a child when I had a big Penguin collection of these Lear verses, was that when you read them as a group, they start to get really, really sinister, because they appear, and I'm not using the internet right stealth term for a certain ethnicity. Yeah, I'm not. It's not that, but a whole group of them they run into this they thing. I mean, I'm sure everyone remembers, when you're a kid and you start to hear sayings like, "Well, that's why they say," and you go, "Well, who's they?" Who are these mysterious people who are setting these rules that we don't know about? I mean, and when you start to think about it, it does become quite Kafkaesque, because, well, who is they? Why are they? Why do they have so much authority? How many of them are there? And in Lear, I've got a collection of ones that involve these sinister theys that are always about. So there was an old man who screamed out whenever they knocked him about. So they took off with boots and fed him with fruits and continued to knock him about. There was an old man with a gong who bumped at it all day long. But they called out, "Oh, Law, you're a horrid old bore." So they smashed that old man with a gong. There was an old person of Sestri who sat himself down in the vestry. When they said, "You are wrong," he merely said, "Bong, that repulsive old person of Sestri." There was an old man of Whitehaven who danced a quadrille with a raven. But they said, "It's absurd to encourage this bird," so they smashed that old man of Whitehaven. There was an old man of Melrose who walked on the tips of his toes. but they said it ain't pleasant to see you at present, you stupid old man of Melrose. It's this constant,
Yeah.
again, very Kafkaesque presence of these people.
Well, this is something that's interesting as well. I think there is a certain with Lear, for instance, or any of the sort of paranoid characters. I'm talking about King Lear here.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
you know, with any of the sort of paranoid characters you get in Shakespeare, you know, the paranoia is part of the fun. You know, they're this hysteric, histrionic character who feels like they're being oppressed and chased down. There are these powers against me, etc. Which is and there's this kind of megalomania about it, which is you know, sort of a delightful thing. It's a facet of comedy, and comedy
Yeah.
always you know, good comedy dances on this line, you know, between sort of really dark stuff and fucked up stuff. You know, brings levity there. It's sort of that's where good comedy happens, I think, which I suppose is a bit of a truism these days, perhaps, but yeah, certainly. And I think also, you know, again, you have to have respect for these absurd little forms, because again, they have a very long history. Martial, the Roman poet, he has a famous one which I remember, and it's non amo te sabidi, nec possum dicere quare, hoc tantum possum dicere, non amo te. Which literally just means, it's two lines. It just means, you know, I don't like you, Sabidius, and I don't know why. But what I do know, Sabidius, is that I don't like you. You know, it's exactly, it's like
lovely.
something that Victorian
Yeah.
could have written. It's just this ridiculous, silly little thing, and it was very, very popular. But again, the fundamental thing here is, which makes them literature and makes them useful as well to a writer, is that in order to write these, you know, a good joke is always to some extent grammatical as well. You know, it's wordplay, it's timing, it's the sort of music of the words, how they sound on the ear,
And
etc.
that's a very important part of the poetic craft, of course, is the timing
Yeah.
and the rhythm and knowing when to play something, you know.
Yeah. And writing things like this, they sort of sharpen the verbal, the poetical muscles, as it were. And you know, no one's really ever been above them. I mean, even the people who, you know, you think of as very stately writers, like I talked about Dante insulting, you know, the Pistoia. Even you look at someone like Pound. I mean, you know, Pound, obviously famous for writing very modern free verse, all etc. etc. But you know, for instance, after the rapturous reception to the Wasteland, Pound, they had a big meeting. Eliot was there to sort of celebrate, and Pound read out this poem in sort of, you know, strict, like, iambic stanzas, a sort of comic poem talking about himself as being like the midwife to the poem. And you know, this stuff has always been appreciated as a sort of delightful thing. It's a part of, it used to be considered part of a civilized life lived well. And it is something that we need to recover. And again, that's why I do want a bit of bawdiness. If we do have a reading, and I would like such readings to become a sort of regular fixture, and you know, away from this idea of every single meeting that, you know, we have to have with our friends, with people that, you know, has to be this sort of political thing. Or even if you're reading you're reading old poetry, you have to be, you know, what is the relation of this poem to the Indo-European Aryan spirit or whatever. It's like, I don't care. I want to meet up. I want to read things.
Just
I
enjoy
want to
the
have
art.
fun.
Just get the
I
pleasure.
want to enjoy myself. Like, and again, if I read a poem by someone who, I don't know, politically was a lefty, like, you know, if you start chimping out about that, I mean, how do you live? Like, you're gonna have a heart attack if you live like
You
this.
can't. I know it's such a dull way to live. I mean,
That's a subversive poem. You know, it's like McCavity the Mystery Cat. I mean, you know, you're supporting crime. You're making light of crime in
It
society.
is absurd.
Terrible.
I mean, I was sharply rebuked recently for basically saying, "Hey guys, why don't we do something other than whinge on Twitter about the
Yeah.
news?" And everyone was like, "Oh, fuck off! You know, well, you don't be a part of this." And it's like, well, really? I mean, is that it? Is that really all you aspire to do? You know.
Again, this is not. We're not trying to sort of poach people away from the political stuff. We're just saying,
But there's more
you
to
know,
life.
come
You know?
along. We'll show you. We'll show you how to have a good time.
Best time of it. So
Yeah.
something I want to ask you, because this is something I think about a lot. Actually, I did want to make one more point before I go on. You know, you mentioned this whole
It's
thing
so
about
rambling. I love it.
this is what it's meant to be. Well, also, I mean, I have 2 bottles of champagne in here, so it's not. I'm not really
Yeah,
structuring this.
I've had
But
about 4 coffees, so I'm just tweaking
you're
in a totally
wired. You're
opposite
actually
direction.
wired as hell. But you mentioned paranoia, and this whole idea, this very intrinsic aspect of comedy and paranoia and megalomania. I'd love to write a book about this because it goes all the way through literature. I mean, I recently was going through Finnegan's Wake,
Oh, yeah. You still not
which
got
of
round
course,
to it.
well, of course, I mean, even the name, it comes from an American Irish pub ballad about a guy called Finnegan, who's a terrible alcoholic. He's a hod carrier on a building site and a drinker.
What's
And
a
one
hod
day,
carrier?
it's someone who basically they have a big wooden sort of pallet called a hod, and they put bricks on it, and they carry bricks to the bricklayers who are putting the
Okay.
bricks down. And one day, a ton of bricks comes and knocks him out, and he's dead. So they all go to Finnegan's wake, right? They have a big wake for him, and all the Irish are there, and of course they're all drinking because it's an Irish funeral. And a drop of whiskey or beer sort of lands on the corpse, and he suddenly jumps back to life, and to start drinking again. So again, and there's I mean, essentially, as I understand it, of course, everyone's take on Finnegan's Wake is going to be completely different. You can make a Clergy out of that. Your take on Finnegan's Wake, but the main character is Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, who is essentially my understanding is that he's having a long, very paranoid, very schizophrenic dream because he's committed some unspecified sexual encounter with 2 girls in Phoenix Park in Dublin, and basically the whole city is rumoring after him. They're all everyone's out to get him. Everyone's saying these terrible things about him. And at one point, someone sings in a pub the ballad of Perce O'Reilly, which is a song that Joyce made up for the book. It's utterly nonsensical. I'll try and read a bit actually. It'd be great for the nonsense poem thing. But the very Joycean pun there is that Perce O'Reilly is an Irish kind of joke, or it's a pun on the French for earwig, which is Perce Oreille, I think. And of course, the guy's name is Earwicker, which is meant to be, which is apparently is a real Scandinavian name.
Well, that's the thing about that book. I mean, I've been told Finnegan's Wake is just this like ginormous lattice of sort of puns and wordplay.
It is really. It's actually really quite funny when you get into it. So anyway, I'll read you. So this is meant to be sung, but I'm not going to do that. So I'll just read you a bit of the ballad of Perce O'Reilly. So it goes like, so this is the dream he's having, and he thinks they're singing a song about him. Anyway, this is how it goes. Have you heard of one Humpty Dumpty? How he fell with a roll and a rumble, and curled up like Lord Oliver Cromwell by the butt of the magazine wall, hump helmet and all. He was one time our king of the castle, now he's kicked about like a rotten old parsnip, and from Green Street he'll be sent by the order of his worship to the penal jail of Mountjoy, jail him and joy. He was father of all schemes for to bother us, slow coaches and immaculate contraceptives for the populace, mare's milk for the sick, 7 dry Sundays a week, open air love, and religion's reform, hideous in form. Arras, why says you, couldn't he manage it? I'll go bail my fine dairyman, darling. Like the bumping bull of the Cassidys, all your butter is in your horns. His butter's in his horns, butter his horns. Hurrah there, hosty, frosty, hosty, change that shirt on ye, rhyme the ran, king of all rans, balbuccio. We had chops, chairs, chewing gum, the chicken pox and china chambers, universally provided by the soft-soaping salesman. Small wonder he'll cheat Erawan, our local lads nicknamed him, when Chimpton first took the floor with his bucket shop store down Bargain Way Law. So anyway, I won't go on. It's great.
Really good.
Actually, I'll just read the last few to conclude it there. So he ought to blush for himself, the old hay-headed philosopher, for to go and shove himself that way on top of her. Big gob, he's the crux of the catalogue of our antediluvial zoo. Messrs. Billing and Co. Noah's Lark's good as new. He was jolting by Wellington's monument, are notorious hippopotamans. When some bugger let down the back trap of the omnibus and he caught his death of fusiliers with his rent in his rears. Give him 6 years. 'Tis sore pity for his innocent poor children, but look out for his missus legitimate. When that Frew gets a grip of old Earwicker, won't there be earwigs on the green? Big earwigs on the green, the largest ever you seen. Sophocles, Shike's power, Pseudodanto, Anonymoses. Then we'll have a Free Gales band and mass meeting, for to sod him the brave son of Scandinavary, and we'll bury him down in Oxman's town, along with the devil and Danes, with the deaf and dumb Danes, and all their remains. And not all the king's men nor his horses will resurrect his corpus, for there's no true spell in Connacht or hell that's able to raise a cane. That's the answer.
It's so good.
Yeah.
I tell you, I'm talking paranoia. It reminds me as well of it's not poetry, but War again, Evelyn War. Yeah. When he was I think in his 50s, maybe 40s, late 40s, he was taking a cruise somewhere, and as people did in, you know, the sort of early half of the 1900s, everyone was on some sort of upper or benzo or something, amphetamines, which you could just buy perfectly legally. Anyway, he was accidentally taking far too much, and whilst he was on the boat, you know, on this like 3-week journey, he was going to like Goa in India or something. He started to just hallucinate terribly. And you know, he talks in his letters about having you know, what they used to call it a persecution complex or something, you know, sort of psychological term. And anyway, he turned this, you know, because he eventually started taking the right dosage when he got back, and he was completely fine. Well, relatively speaking, he was always a bit of a nut, but he wrote a book about this called, you know, a fictionalized version of himself called "The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold." And it's hysterical, you know, because he's sitting in his cabin, in his berth on the ship, and obviously you have sort of, you know, vents on the ceiling or what have you, and he hears these voices coming in through the vents, and he hears voices on the radio as well talking about him. And, you know, they say the funniest things, and Waugh says that, you know, this is what he heard. It's stuff like, you know, I've heard that Pinfold is a queer. You know, I've heard that he's a queer Jew, and then another voice will say something like, but you know, there's two kinds of queers. There's a pansy and there's a butch. A butch is one that doesn't act like a queer. Mr. Pinfold is a butch. You know, just these,
God,
it's hysterically funny. But again, born out of this like really dark place, and was sort of psyche or subconscious or whatever you want to call it, but it's just fantastic, and all these things come from that sort of that idea of persecution and anxiety.
Well, it's so Catholic, isn't it? It's a real Catholic complex of the guilt and the persecution, isn't it? You know, they're after you. They're coming to get you. You know, you ever read or seen Pinter's play The Birthday Party?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's so good, because it's basically all about that. It's this washed up guy living in this English boarding house in the seaside somewhere. I mean, in the 50s, and when I say boarding house, it's an old woman, a dotty old woman, and her husband who let a room out, and they call it a boarding house. I mean, you know, I think in the first scene he comes down for breakfast, and it's a bowl of cornflakes and a piece of fried bread. I mean, that's that sort of thing. And two ambiguous men arrive. It's almost a bit like Pulp Fiction, like two men in suits, you know, showing up to come and take him away. And one of them's called Goldberg. You know, no guesses there. And the other one's called McCann, who's a real like heavy brawling Irishman with a penchant for drink. And of course, Goldberg is meant to be this kind of small, very live, very talkative Jew. And they both kind of, it's very funny, but it's a really sinister, menacing play. Where they slowly break his mind down, and they torture him, and they ask him all these completely meaningless questions about what tea shop he went to in 1934 and where did he keep his suits and is the number 846 possible or necessary and all this sort of thing. And it just utterly breaks him down. And they kind of drag him away off at the end as if he's being dragged off to hell. I mean, and Pinter, who was Jewish, specifically said that he wanted to make the two characters who come and get him the Irishman, not a Catholic Irishman and a Jew, because he said these are the two religions that are most obsessed with guilt and punishment. I love that. Yeah.
I mean, that's another thing. I mean, of course, you talk about Jewish comedy and the reasons for Jewish comedy, and I do think part of that is the Jew has always had this sort of this persecution and this the resulting sort of ironical attitude. And I mean, this is what makes someone like Woody Allen, if you watch Woody Allen's early stand-up or you read his jokes and stuff, really, really funny. I suppose the example today would be someone like Larry David. It's that exact attitude of sort of the poor schlemiel.
Yeah. It's gonna kvetch all over you.
Yeah.
But yeah, just
I was thinking about
sorry. Mm-hmm. No, sorry, you go.
No, I mean it's a subject change, but I was just thinking in terms of sort of satirical or comic stuff I've been reading recently, and I've been reading Pope quite a lot, and this is something that
Dante.
Yeah, well, I'm not the Dante actually, no. But I've been reading sort of the essay on criticism, but I think I've been reading a lot of actual literary criticism, etc. And I think it's interesting because I read Eliot's essays. Eliot has these 3 essays on these sort of Augustan poets, as they're called, the poets of sort of late 1600s, early 1700s. Pope and Dryden and what have you. And he points out that, these men are very much devalued. There's a sort of a cult of the Elizabethans and there's a cult around the Romantics, but these guys are just considered sort of, it's sing-song, it's stale, it's prosaic or whatever. But I mean, in terms of sort of craftsmanship and stuff, I mean, a lot of it's wonderful and very entertaining. I mean, you've got to consider, I mean, I learned this and I was blown away that Pope, who was a Catholic, so he's barely allowed to go to school. He was self-educated to a large extent. He was very, very ill. He was like 4'3" and a hunchback. He wasn't even legally, he wasn't even allowed in London at the time when he was growing up because he was Catholic. He wrote, was it the Ode to Solitude, where it's like, happy the man whose wish and care a few paternal acres bound, content to breathe his native air in his own ground. I mean, he wrote that when he was 12.
It goes to show the standard of education as well, even for a persecuted man.
Yeah, but I mean, the essay on criticism is wonderful because it's just this sort of it's irregular in the size of the stanzas, but metrically it's flawless, and it just inspired by Horace and his sort of Ars Poetica. He just sort of talks about the idea of criticism and the idea of wit and what a critic should be, what an artist should be. And I could just read like a couple of stanzas just for people to get the idea and go away and read it themselves. And it opens with a quote from Horace's epistles: "Si quid novisti rectios istis, candidus imperti, si non his utere mecum." If you have come to know any precept more correct than these, share it with me, brilliant one. If not, use these with me. And then it starts part 1. "'Tis hard to say if greater want of skill appear in writing or in judging ill. But of the two, less dangerous is the fence to tire our patience than mislead our sense. Some few in that, but numbers err in this. 10 censure wrong for one who writes amiss. A fool might once himself alone expose, now one in verse makes many more in prose. 'Tis with our judgments as our watches. None go just alike, yet each believes his own. In poets as true genius is but rare, true taste as seldom is the critic's share. Both must alike from heaven derive their light, these born to judge as well as those to write. Let such teach others who themselves excel, and censure freely who have written well. Authors are partial to their wit, 'tis true, but are not critics to their judgment too? Yet if we look more closely, we shall find most have the seeds of judgment in their mind. Nature affords at least a glimmering light. The lines, though touched but faintly, are drawn right. But as the slightest sketch, if justly traced, is by ill colouring but the more disgraced, so by false learning is good sense defaced. Some are bewildered in the maze of schools, and some made coxcombs nature meant but fools. In search of wit, these lose their common sense, and then turn critics in their own defence. Each burns alike who can or cannot write, or with a rival's or an eunuch's spite. All fools have still an itching to deride, and fain would be upon the laughing side. If Mevius scribble in Apollo's spite, there are who judge still worse than he can write. And it just keeps going in this sort of flawless, very witty, very learned way. And when that last line, by the way, if Mevius scribbled Apollo's spite, that's a reference to I think it's in Virgil. Virgil writes, there's a reference in one of his poems or a couple of his poems to this poet in Rome, a contemporary of his called Mevius, and supposedly there was another poet called Bavius, and these were two sort of terrible poetasters who wrote this really sort of shoddy verse and just viciously had their own school and sort of viciously attacked people like Virgil. And which is very, very funny. This the idea that there were just these sort of shit posters called Bavius and Mavius who were just shitting all over Virgil. But I love Pope because it is this sort of extremely elegant, civilized form of
well, he was a real master of rhyme. In an age when, of course, rhyme was fairly standard, but it was acknowledged. I mean, it's the truth, unfortunately, that English is an extremely rhyme-poor language. Compared to almost any other European language, there's very, very few words that rhyme, which means that in order to make rhyme poetry work, you've got to really know what you're doing without resorting to awful cliches.
Or ridiculous sort of rearranging of the order of sentences.
To try and cram it in. That's what I call the Procrustean approach to verse. The bed of Procrustes. But it's something that Pope chose to do was to famously write a lot of his work in the form of the heroic couplet. Quite long works as well, which of course means that he really had to keep an eye on his economy of words because in English you will eventually reach a point at which you run out of rhymes, because there just aren't that many.
But that was a satirical move. I mean, to write in heroic couplets, which, as the name suggests, were usually about some heroic lay or ballad or romance about a knight or a hero, and turn it into, just shitting on these terrible critics or poets or some woman, some courtesan, some coxcomb, some tart. I mean, that in itself was a sort of a statement, I suppose.
Well, as well, I think he was generally attacking the overabundance of mock classicism that was going on at that time. Everybody, because it was kind of like every Grub Street hack wanted to be the next kind of Herodotus, or the next Virgil or something.
And I think he's aware of that. It's sort of like the poetical equivalent of like Hogarth or something.
Yeah, it is a satire in and of itself to write like that. I mean, I think I mentioned it on the last stream we did, but Dr. Johnson was particularly annoyed at everybody trying to write in ancient Greek kind of or Latin forms without having the imagination or vocabulary to back it up. And his example of how you can choose an Alexandrian hexameter as your form, but you can say something like I put my hat upon my head and walked into the Strand, and there I met another man whose hat was in his hand. It doesn't matter what form you choose. If the words are mundane, then it's a mundane piece of verse.
But I do think people would do well to read more Pope and Dryden. It's good. It's good sort of. I find. If you're trying to write, especially, it's good to constantly be reading this stuff and try and get to the point where spontaneously lines like iambic lines or will pop into your head. You begin to almost think in meter, which I think you have to be doing. And if you read
about it.
Yeah, and if you read a long essay of Pope's, one of these poetical essays, that it will have that effect. You let those things sort of rumble around in your mind, and it's good for you. It's very salutary or salutary.
speaking of rhyming, do you mind if it's a bit apropos of nothing, but I'd just like to read a poem here. I don't know anything about the author. I don't know if he's a very famous at all, but his name is Patrick Barrington. And this is
Is he
the only
dead?
poem.
Is he alive?
No idea. I've no idea. But this one poem has always been a favorite of mine because it's a real good rhymer and it's also quite funny. It's not very long, but it's called "I Had a Duck-Billed Platypus," and it goes like this. I had a duck-billed platypus when I was up at Trinity, with whom I soon discovered a remarkable affinity. He used to live in lodgings with myself and Arthur Purvis, and we all went up together for the diplomatic service. I had a certain confidence, I own, in his ability. He mastered all the subjects with remarkable facility. And Purvis, though more dubious, agreed that he was clever, but no one else imagined he had any chance whatever. I failed to pass the interview. The board, with wry grimaces, took exception to my boots and then objected to my braces. And Purvis, too, was failed by an intolerant examiner who said he had his doubts as to his sock suspender's stamina. The bitterness of failure was considerably mollified, however, by the ease with which our platypus had qualified. The wisdom of the choice, it soon appeared, was undeniable. There was never a diplomat more thoroughly reliable. He never made rash statements his enemies might hold him to. He never stated anything, for no one ever told him to. And soon he was appointed, so correct was his behavior, our minister without portfolio to Transmoravia. My friend was loved and honored from the Andes to Estonia. He soon achieved a pact between Peru and Patagonia. He never vexed the Russians nor offended the Romanians. He pacified the Letts and yet appeased the Lithuanians. Won approval from his masters down in Downing Street, oh holy so. He was soon to be rewarded with the grant of a portfolio. When, alas, on the anniversary of Greek emancipation, he laid an egg inside the Bulgarian legation. This untoward occurrence caused unheard of repercussions, giving rise to epidemics of sword clanking in the Prussians. The Poles began to threaten, the Finns began to flap at him, directing all the blame for this unfortunate mishap at him, while the Swedes withdrew entirely from the Anglo-Saxon dailies, the right of photographing the aurora borealis, and all efforts at rapprochement in the meantime proving barren. The Japanese, in self-defense, annexed the Isle of Arran. My platypus, once thought to be more cautious and more tentative than any other living diplomatic representative, was now a sort of warning to all diplomatic students of the risks attached to negligence, the perils of imprudence, and branded in the honours list as Platypus Dame Vera, retired a lonely figure to lay eggs at Bordighera.
That's very good.
Yeah, I quite like that.
It reminds me of because I assume you've tried your hand at writing some stuff like this. I remember one that I wrote came to mind about Hitchens. I don't know if I'd read that to you. It's a Clara here actually.
No, go on, go on. Is this one you wrote? You wrote.
This is mine, yeah.
Original work here.
Christopher Hitchens was terribly bad. What was the drinking? An atheist fad. But who wouldn't drink and drink by the litre if he had a brother like his brother Peter?
Yeah, I like that. Oh.
Yeah.
So now
everyone should write these things, right? A limerick.
It's just fun. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't take that long if you've got a spare moment or something to try and come up with something. Because the more you do it, the quicker you get. Being able to
have something off the cuff sometimes. It's quite fun.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, because obviously a key part of this type of humor is the influence of obscenity and of dirtiness into things, which I think is an art unto itself. For a long time, I wanted to write a short book called the Joy of Obscenity, just about, kind of the traditions of bawdy verses and kind of drinking songs and things, and incorporate this stuff. Because, again, like with everything we talk about, it does actually require a lot of flair and a lot of skill to do it in just the right way, so that you don't just it doesn't just become utterly foul and it drowns itself in that, but it also isn't too quaint. It's got to have that balance. I mean, off the top of my head, because I think the trick is having something obscene that can be interpreted as being clean, and has that kind of sort of naughtiness to it. Like what was it? Was that limerick? Someone taught me it when I was about 7, and it was a lady whose principles were clear said, "You may think it funny, my dear, but my front entry is reserved for the gentry. It's tradesmen who come in the rear. Things like that.
Yeah,
So
I mean
what's
that's
your what's your kind of take on this as a comedic trope or device?
well, like, yeah. I mean, I think obscenity's always been around in one form or another. It is just a question of, like anything. I mean, you people talk about making art out of mundane things. You can do that if you can make art out of just seeing someone walking down the street or some sort
Mm,
of scene from life like that. Then I think you can do the same thing with vulgarity, and I think similar sort of rules apply. And it does become a question of form, and also just I mean sheer wit. I do think the 18th century, they were the real masters of that. I mean, I think of there's a great example of Pitt the Younger, the
mm.
prime minister, um, who never married, and obviously there were lots of jokes and insinuations made by the Whigs about that. And the Morning Herald, which was the one of the papers then, um, there were sort of satirical verses in the paper about Pitt's lack of knowledge of women. And there's one here, and this is, I think, is fantastic. And again, you can read it in two ways, which is always the sign of a really good piece of work. It could be interpreted in a clean way. I think that
Mm.
sort of censorship in a way helped sharpen that.
Well,
Um,
it's like watching someone walk a tightrope. They've got to
exactly.
have the perfect amount of balance for it to be funny and also not be terrible. To get
But
in
anyway,
trouble.
it's just a small couple of lines, and it goes, "'Tis true, indeed, we oft abuse him, because he bends to no man, but slander's self dares not accuse him of stiffness to a woman." I mean, obviously you can read that as just stiffness, rudeness, but we don't dare accuse him of stiffness to a woman. I don't need to explain it, and that sort of stuff is delightful. It'd be very well done. And again, it makes me think of Eliot. I think it's sometimes also just a good turn of phrase where you take something
Mm.
vulgar and turn it into something really clever and delightful. It's in Whispers of Immortality, where there's this line where he says, he's talking about this woman, this strange woman called Grishkin, and he says, Grishkin is nice. Her Russian eye is underlined for emphasis, uncorseted. Her friendly bust gives promise of pneumatic bliss. I mean,
Pneumatic.
pneumatic
It's
bliss.
the it's
I
the,
mean,
just the sense of knowing what, like a technical term like pneumatic being brought in just makes it all the
yeah,
more fun, doesn't it? I mean, it's the word music there.
fantastic.
Here's
So,
here's
yeah,
what
I
here's
mean, obscenity certainly has a place, and again, if you fall away from that, or if you disregard it completely, I do think again you're falling into that trap that I harp on far too much about of, um, equating good art and good morals. Doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't work that way. I mean, I if we're going to do kind of comedic like verse, we have to bring up, especially because I know we've got a couple of viewers who aren't from the UK in the chat. They may not know about this, but there's a famous poem by a woman called Felicia Hemans, called is it? I think it's Casablanca or Casabianca. I'll just check. But people will know it because the first lines are: "The boy stood on the burning deck, whence all but he had fled. The flame that lit the battle's wreck shone round him o'er the dead." Um, and it's about a young French boy at the Battle of the Nile, I think, whose ship has been destroyed, and his father, who is the captain, is dead, and the boy's crying out for his father. But instead of being scared, the boy says, "No, I'm gonna go down with the ship because it's what I must do."
Mm,
And because of its kind of patriotic values and fairly steady meter, this poem was basically forced upon every British schoolboy from
mm,
about sort of I mean, when was it written? 1826. So it was, I mean, pretty much from when it was written up to about 1970. I mean, everyone had to learn it by rote, which of course meant that everybody used it as the basis for dirty rhymes, basically.
mm.
And of course, now as soon as I try and think of something, will gone from my head. Normally, I just can think of them all the time. But yeah, it's well known for parody.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's something that's a very old history. I mean, I read a book by a guy called Briffaut recently about the troubadours. I've been reading a number of works about the troubadours, and there was a specific form called the Cervantes, I think,
Mm.
And the whole point of the Cervantes is you would take, and the troubadours were constantly competing, devising like ever more autistic and intricate forms. I mean, you think of
Mm.
like Arnaud with the sestina.
Yeah,
But even
the
even today,
villanelles.
even today, the sort of logic of the sestina is debated. But the other poets would come along later, and they would take the sestina, or they would take a particular variety of a discours, which was a sort of
Mm.
a form of varying standards to express like distress. And instead of it being a poem about love, instead of it being an aubade where you're talking about two lovers waking up and one of them has to flee, it would be some political subject or satirical subject. So but again, that the power of that relies on people already knowing the original form. And that is something that you got to think about with comedy as well. Or just the level of reading today. I mean, I think the average Dino, if you started reading to him about like Grishkin and pneumatic bliss, he'd be like, "You what, mate?" He's not gonna understand what pneumatic bliss is supposed to mean. I
No.
mean, so
Well, because
these
they've
things,
lost the connection with their own language. I mean,
yeah,
there's been this terrible
just dumbing
disconnect where
down of
they've
everything.
well, yeah, they deliberately force this idea onto people that to have any kind of cultural awareness or any kind of understanding of how to speak English properly, that it makes you somehow alien or inauthentic. One of the worst things they ever did.
Mm. Yeah, and I hope that this can be allayed. I mean, and this is why I think having these sorts of meetings will be good, because in a way, what I kind of want is I kind of want a body, um, George Christ, like in the same way that Stefan George had this poetic circle.
Mm.
I want a circle that can focus on these sorts of things with people who can appreciate it and you can have fun. Because again, perhaps I mean we have in the preceding centuries, essentially since the printing press, as trite as that sounds, we have lived in an ever increasingly literate world. The numbers of people who are literate and cultured has been increasing and increasing and increasing until you got to the days of the modernists, where a work of literature could reach this ginormous audience, this vast audience, and it could be understood and appreciated by that vast audience. And now we seem to sort of be heading in the other direction. And that doesn't mean that art is going to die. But again, if you look at Dante's day, right, the comedy that would have been hand copied by monks, by
Yeah.
people who knew him, by friends. It would have been shared around amongst certain learned circles, enjoyed, appreciated in that way. Um, and then going all the way up to the sort of reaction against the mass literature of the 19th and 20th century, people like Stefan George, Georga, who had this elite small circle, focused on themselves, this sort of esoteric writing and reading, a small publication, a book that would come out once, sort of shot into the world occasionally.
Yeah.
But the art doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be mass. Of course, it's sad that we're in this state where it can't be appreciated by more people. But if we focus on developing amongst ourselves a circle where literature can breathe, then that in and of itself is a fulfilling thing. We don't need, I mean, we don't need mass appeal. I mean, don't get me wrong. I want money. I want lots of money. I want fame. I want I want all of those things. I think everyone's lying if they say they don't. But I think just if you can preserve, if you can write one decent poem, one good poem, and it can be preserved and enjoyed amongst a small circle, then that is a victory. That is a triumph. Um, and if you have that as your goal, it's something that I think is achievable. Of course, it's unfortunate. I think some arts might be in a better place than others for this. I mean, in fact, I certainly think they are. I mean, for instance, music, what gets called classical music, just music, is in a very tough spot because, of course, there are far more moving parts with music than there are with poetry. Poetry requires one person, a piece of paper, and a pen. But with a great piece of music, you need a fantastic, composer who can write the damn thing, and that requires any number of factors you need, and then you need the musicians to play it, right?
Mm.
there's a lot of moving parts, there are a lot of pieces, and that's something that's much harder to sort of recover, or something that's especially as well because of the vast amount of resources demanded. It's something that's very hard to cultivate these days. I mean, of course, originally it was court music.
Yes.
It was music. It was music for lords and stuff. But today, that kind of music relies on the public. It relies on ticket sales and things like that. And it relies on dumbing down to survive at all, which is difficult. And that's that. I'm glad I'm not a composer or a violinist or something like that. It's very difficult. But again, I think you have to do what you can. Yeah, I mean, I'm rambling somewhat, but I hope
But
you
no, it's
see where I'm
true. I
going
mean,
from.
I completely agree with it. We need to. I hope create around us, as you say, a kind of court in exile, as it were.
Hmm. And that means
Somewhere.
that for us, poetry is going to have to take the no politics and things like that. It's going to have to take the back seat. Um, yeah, it just has to.
It has
I
to.
think of course I love Pound, but I do think people are right when they say that when Pound became really invested in sort of economic theories and politics, his verse suffered for that. Of course, you did have some wonders come out of the economic theories. I mean, with Uzura is a wonderful piece of poetry, but there's a lot of gibberish as well. I mean, you read the cantos and you just have a canto where it's nothing but sort of excerpts from letters of like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson talking about sort of vague questions of economics, and that's not really verse; it's a sort of collage. If so it sort of suffers, and you get sidetracked and you get away. And if Pound had taken all of his significant energies, if he had taken his gifts and focused on politics, economics throughout his entire life, we would never have, and then we went down to breakers, fourth on the godly sea.
Mm.
We bore sheep aboard that swart ship. And I dug the L square pitkin, and this wonderful, wonderful verse. We wouldn't have any of that because he had to give all of his energy to that. It's a very demanding thing.
It is.
And then perhaps, obviously people don't appreciate that. I mean, I'm sure the people listening do, but there's an idea that poetry is just this thing that just drops out of the sky. You're inspired and you write something, and it's not. It's not. It requires infinite amounts of work and labor, and sometimes it might look like you're doing nothing at all, but you are.
Well, that's
Very
that's the real thing about poetry, and is that, and this is what annoys me, is that someone will go and stand in front of a Rembrandt, say, and they'll go, God, look at that. That is magnificent. But they don't go, right, I'm going to stop at the art shop, grab some grab some paintbrushes and see if I can, do that when I get home. People don't go and hear Beethoven and go, right, I'll just grab some composition paper and I'll be able to do that. But for whatever reason, they assume that they read a sonnet by Shakespeare and they go, oh, well, I could do that had I the mind to.
Yeah.
I
He
can't,
was just
who
really sensitive. He just felt very strongly, and it just came to him. I mean, that's yeah.
I think just to back that up, the real tragedy of Pound, as you say, was that I think his theories were too grand for his talent, and that's not to say that he was untalented in any way. He was a very great talent, but he essentially was more concerned about directing the scene and directing where Western arts were going than he was, but by sort of writing it, if that makes sense.
Well, never mind Western art, Western civilization in general. I mean, if you read his essays, they become very megalomaniacal. I mean, he talks about his explicit goal was to create another Renaissance, and he says that in the same way that the original Renaissance happened because you had these Arab writings coming in, you had these Northern Gothic writings, you had Greeks rediscovered, etc. All these influences going into the explosion in the Quattrocento. We needed something like that again. I mean, we need all these impulses coming in, flying in to create a sort of vortex. I mean, that's where he chucks in the Chinese stuff and the Japanese stuff, and when you mix it with the American stuff, he's trying to create the atmosphere for a renaissance. And these massive goals to set yourself, and you can see why people thought that he was mad. I mean, he was a little bit mad, but then again, on the other hand, you think to yourself, if he didn't have that sort of drive, would he have been able to work? I mean, Pound worked at an astonishing pace. You might disagree with his work, you might not like him, but you can't deny his energy. I mean, if you look at the number of letters that he wrote and where he was, he's constantly here, there, doing this, talking to this person, getting funding for that person, penning something in this magazine.
Manic
It's a manic level of energy. Yeah. So yeah, I do think he went a little off the deep end, and he got too focused on politics and things outside of the writing. But I'll always defend him, and I do think it's very poignant. I mean, this is again an aside, a digression, but whatever. Of course, the cantos have problems, but I do think it's beautiful that the last lines of the cantos are just this, in the same way Pound writes the famous "In the Station of a Metro" when he's a young man. At the very end of the cantos, Pound's this old man. It's the last one he wrote. The last lines are "a little light, like a rushlight, to lead back into splendor." I mean, that is just beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. Rushlight is one of these lights, literally made out of like a rush, rushes from beside the river. A little light like a rushlight to lead back into splendor. And I think I am glad he ended on a note like that. I think it's very poignant. Yeah. And then you have like the ant as a centaur in his dragon world, which is like pure schizo, but I do love it.
Yeah. I mean, he did have a mind for the old effects,
he did.
The old thunder and lightning, as it were.
He did.
Dear me. No, it's and again that returning to splendor, I mean, ultimately, what else are we trying to do? I mean,
it sticks in your line. It sticks in your mind, a line like that, or where he has this beautiful command, where the Pisan canvas, where he says, "Under white clouds, cielo de Pisa, out of all this beauty, something must come." There's just Pound has this ability to write these incredibly, astonishingly resonant lines, and it's hard to unpick exactly how he does it, but he does it. I think it's a testament to him, the fact that he's still taught and still read today when so many other people have been just infinitely cancelled. It's still the sort of English lit girls called like Greta and Genevieve. They're still forced in their classes to read like based Pound because he's undeniable in that way. And again, he's undeniable because of the art. If he was just some political hack, he'd be totally forgotten by now. No one would know his name.
No,
he's known
purely. He'd end up
like
Wyndham Lewis, who isn't taught.
Well, yeah. Wyndham, he did become sort of a pamphleteer, didn't he? Well, is there anything else that we should cover? I think we're kind of running out of steam, or at least I am. I think the coffee is starting to wear off.
Well, I'm just getting more and more drunk. I mean, I'm just. I mean, do we have anything else we want to read? Or, I mean, the thing is, I think we've kind of basically come full circle on that topic. I mean, we've kind of we managed to go to the summation of Ezra Pound via dirty limericks, basically. I mean, I'm quite impressed with that. It's that's what the critics call breadth.
I'm really not sure. I tell you, I am going to go and try and read Finnegan's Wake at some point when I get the time, because you've really sold it to me.
Utterly bizarre. I mean, the thing is, like, it's. I'm pretty sure that the whole argument behind him writing it was that sometimes you just have to give up comprehension. I mean, basically, you just have to, because it is basically one long Titanic train crash of
schizo post.
In the but it is quite fun. It is quite fun, and I'll tell you
one thing which might surprise people. This isn't so much comment, but now that we're just onto the sort of miscellany section of the podcast, or I hate calling it a podcast, but
the ramble.
Yeah, well, people know
Discourse.
Joyce. Discourse. Yeah, so people know Joyce because of Portrait of the Arts as Young Man, Ulysses, Finnegan's Wake. But Joyce was trained in music when he was younger, and he wrote poems. which the poems couldn't be further from the kind of stuff that you've been showing, or the sort of kind of letters that you would write to his wife, which we all know about.
Oh,
Joyce,
God, we're not
yeah,
even
Joyce,
can't go there.
and Pound remarks on this in, I think, Instigations, or one of his essays, where he was sort of bigging up Joyce, and he says, like the poetry is very different from what you would expect if you've read his novels, etc. But he published this collection called chamber music, and there's one called Tutto Sciolto, I think. Let me see. Let me find it. Yes, it's called Tutto Sciolto, which basically means, I think, like all is lost in Italian. And this is Joyce. This is the man who wrote the fart letters, who wrote Finnegan's Wake, right? Which is just fascinating. It shows you're talking about rain.
Don't
You're talking about
spoil the
rain.
letters. Don't spoil the letters.
I'm not spoiling them. I've told you before, when I was at university, I had an Irish friend, and I would get him to read them at parties because it was just fucking hysterical.
Yeah, but
anyway,
you have to just refer to them as the letters, wink, wink, so that normies
the
don't
letters,
know.
yeah. Shall we crack out the letters? But
no.
Anyway,
well, I'll have another glass and see. But anyway, go on.
So we're talking about range. So this is Tutto Sciolto by Joyce. A birdless heaven, sea dusk, and a star sad in the west. And thou, poor heart, love's image fond and far, rememberest. Her silent eyes and her soft foam white brow and fragrant hair, falling as in the silence falleth now dusk from the air. Ah, why wilt thou remember these, or why, poor heart, repine, if the sweet love she yielded with a sigh was never thine? I mean, that's Joyce. I mean, that's a beautiful, metrically flawless piece of work. And again, it just goes to show you that a lot of these preconceived notions that people have about modernists or about artists that they know, people who are rebuked for being degenerate or for attacking arts. I mean, that's classic work there. It's classic work. And Eliot wrote sonnets in his early days, which are very classic. Pound, of course, Pound when he was in university, when he was like 21, 22, he wrote like a sonnet a day for about a year. And you can get the collected early works of Ezra Pound. You can get all of these poems, the ones that he didn't burn or destroy, and you can see that he was
that's a wonderful
very good at these. He did. I mean,
you've got but the thing is that when one sets one's sights on becoming a poet, that kind of work ethic is what's required. I mean, it's
absolutely.
Like
you need to be writing all the time,
showing out these verses. Yeah, it should always be going on. I mean, I'm not being hyperbolic when I say it's got to be the most important thing in one's life. It's got to be.
I mean,
poets aren't easy to live with.
I've had occasions. I think something that be a real pain in the arse, and I don't want to I don't want to sound melancholic or say "woe is me" because I love poetry, but you have occasions where I don't know, you get back from a night out or you've a long day at work and you're ready to go to bed and you've just gotten into bed and nodding off, and then suddenly some good lines will sort of pop into your head, and you have to sort of slap yourself awake and claw around for a notebook or something, or your phone, and put it in the notes app, because you're terrified that if you fall asleep you won't remember it.
Oh, you've got to do it. You've got to get them down. Got to get that. There's no other way. Yeah.
And then you can sort of piece things together. I mean, I think it's Larkin, again in the Betjeman interview, which everyone should watch, by the way. It's on YouTube.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly what it's called, Monitor or something, maybe the BBC series, but it's Philip Larkin and John Betjeman. Betjeman, famous for saving Ink St Pancras Station in London, sort of big,
and for come friendly bombs and fall on Slough. It isn't fit for humans now.
Yeah, or the crematorium as well, which is a good poem. Yeah, and Larkin says essentially, sometimes poetic inspiration does sort of exist, and Larkin, as cynical as he was, he does say that sometimes you will just have these, say, these two really good lines come into your head, and you'll spend the next, I don't know, weeks, months, maybe finding the rest of the lines for those two lines that came into your head,
and around them,
and building out of what you were given originally.
And again,
that requires sometimes that kind of thing will just fall into your hat at a random moment, and you just need to, again, you need to be in a place where you can say, all right, everything else needs to wait. This is the most important thing.
Some of the best instructional material ever written on this stuff is in one of the Clive James books on poetry. I think it's in the Poetry Notebook where he talks about this, because I've never seen anyone write so lucidly on verse composition. Basically, I mean, because he says that
I've not got
because
around to James. He was a great critic.
it's so brilliant. I mean,
One of the
there are poems in Larkin's notebooks that would have been brilliant if he'd published them, but you can see why he didn't, because evidently he'd come up with a central concept or a couple of lines that was so powerful that he hadn't yet constructed a powerful enough verse around them. Because one of the amateur mistakes is to come up with a really good central few lines and build something weak around them, and you can kind of see it. It's like it would be like putting a diamond in a plastic tiara. You can just kind of see immediately what went on. Where, of course, the whole art with poetry is to not let anyone see behind the curtain. No one should be able to see the scaffolding of the composition as such.
Well, that's every art, I think. Yeah, I mean, you should present a finished work of art, shouldn't you? But I'll tell you, I could also do it's kind of comic, but also kind of dark. It's another of Larkin's poems which I've memorized recently and I've been reciting.
Another excellent habit everyone should be doing.
Take One Home for the Kiddies.
Yes.
Yeah, which I love. Right, it's really short. So it goes on shallow straw, in shadeless glass, huddled by empty bowls, they sleep. No dark, no dam, no dew, no grass. Mom, get us one of them to keep. Living toys are something novel, but it soon wears off somehow. Fetch the shoebox, fetch the shovel. Mom, we're playing funerals now, which is obviously just about kids buying a pet from the pet shop. Again, a very sort of mundane thing, and it starts off sad, but it has this humorous punchline that's also very disturbing. And Larkin was a master at that.
Yeah, I mean, because he had a real intense fear of marriage and of family, because he viewed it as just the ultimate destroyer of the individual man. Basically, he said that
it's very funny, by the way.
A woman.
There is a recording of Larkin reading that poem on YouTube, and he reads it exactly like that. Mom, we're playing funerals now. And if you know anything about Larkin and his voice, it's hysterical. It's really, really funny. I'll tell you as well. Sure. I was speaking recently. I was telling people in London about it. Very funny. In that same interview where Larkin's, because he was a librarian, as everyone knows. He's talking about his career as a librarian and how he's a poet as well. I'm sort of paraphrasing because I can't quite remember, but he says, well, I have poetry as a sort of outlet, but in my work, of course, I take great pride in my work. If you were to read the minutes of my meetings, of the meetings we have in the library, they're very good minutes. But I'm afraid I've quite exhausted the limits of the minute as an art form.
Well, I mean, to his credit, he was a really brilliant librarian. I mean,
he was a master. He got in great books. Everyone spoke very highly of him. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, should we have a brief impromptu session on Elliot on Larkin just quickly?
I think so. And then I'm going to drop off in about
because I want to read my favorite Larkin poem, and I think his masterpiece, which is Au Bard.
I might disagree with you on that, but
I don't want to. Well, listen, because I don't want to bring the tone down. So what I thought we'd do is we'd read some of the more funny ones after that, so we don't end on Au Bard. It's a bit grim.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a miniature epic, really. We should say Au Bard is kind of a troubadouric. Yeah, because it has to do with the morning light, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the word literally means dawn. It comes all the way from Provence. These ideas of lovers parting in the morning and stuff like that.
And it's such a pure example to me of what a metrical master Larkin was. I mean, the absolute precision in the language here, and in the
there's such subtlety in it as well.
There is, but at the same time, there's no pretension or no. There is the language is plain, and yet it explodes at you. With effect.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, like everyone else, he wrote some corkers occasionally, but yeah, I mean.
So anyway, I'll read Au Bard. I work all day and get half drunk at night. Waking at 4 to soundless dark, I stare. In time, the curtain edges will grow light. Till then, I see what's really always there. Unresting death, a whole day nearer now, making all thought impossible, but how and where and when I shall myself die. Arid interrogation, yet the dread of dying and being dead flashes afresh to hold and horrify. The mind blanks at the glare, not in remorse, the good not done, the love not given, time torn off, unused, nor wretchedly because an only life can take so long to climb clear of its wrong beginnings, and
Mm.
may never, but at the total emptiness forever, the sure extinction that we travel to and shall be lost in always, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon nothing more terrible, nothing more true. This is a special way of being afraid no trick dispels. Religion used to try, that vast, moth eaten, musical brocade, created to pretend we never die. And specious stuff that says no rational being can fear a thing it will not feel, not seeing that this is what we fear. No sight, no sound, no touch or taste or smell, nothing to think with, nothing to love or link with, the anesthetic from which none come round. And so it stays just on the edge of a vision, a small unfocused blur, a standing chill that slows each impulse down to indecision. Most things may never happen, this one will. And in realization of it rages out in furnace fear when we're caught without people or drink. Courage is no good. It means not scaring others. Being brave lets no one off the grave. Death is no different whined at than withstood. Slowly, light strengthens, and the room takes shape. It stands plain as a wardrobe, what we know, have always known, know that we can't escape, yet can't accept. One side will have to go. Meanwhile, telephones crouch, getting ready to ring in locked up offices, and all the uncaring, intricate, rented world begins to rouse. The sky is white as clay with no sun. Work has to be done. Postmen, like doctors, go from house to house.
It's so good. I mean,
Haunting.
uncaring, intricate, rented world. I mean,
And
so
I love that description of religion, even though I don't necessarily agree with it. I love that description of religion as that
Mhm.
vast, moth-eaten musical brocade.
It's great.
It's
I'll
just
tell you, the one that I'll read, it's slightly lighter. I'll read Mr. Bleeny, and then I think I really must go. Also, because my laptop that I'm using is going to die in like
it's
5
gonna
minutes. But
overheat and keel over.
oh, I forgot about all bad. Yeah. It's the kind of thing that does make you want to just sit. I mean, what can I really say? But yeah.
Can't be answered to. I mean, it really
But
can't.
anyway, I'll read Mr. Bleeny. Mr. Bleeny. This was Mr. Bleeny's room. He stayed the whole time he was at the bodies, till they moved him. Flowered curtains, thin and frayed, fall to within 5 inches of the sill, whose window shows a strip of building land, tussocky, littered. Mr. Bleeny took my bit of garden properly in hand. Bed, upright chair, 60-watt bulb, no hook behind the door, no room for books or bags. I'll take it. So it happens that I lie where Mr. Bleeny lay, and stub my fags on the same saucer souvenir, and try stuffing my ears with cotton wool to drown the jabbering set he egged her on to buy. I know his habits, what time he came down, his preference for sauce to gravy, why he kept on plugging at the four-ways, likewise their yearly frame, the Frinton folk who put him up for summer holidays, and Christmas at his sister's house in Stoke. But if he stood and watched the frigid wind tousling the clouds, lay on the fusty bed, telling himself that this was home, and grinned and shivered, without shaking off the dread that how we live measures our own nature, and at his age having no more to show than one hired box should make him pretty sure he warranted no better, I don't know. That's it.
I love the way Larkin ends a poem because
Yeah.
he almost sort of cuts you off right when your kind of dread and melancholy at the feeling is
There's no
at its
comfort. Yeah.
apogee, and then it
I love that line.
stops.
Yeah, I mean that how we live measures our own nature. I
Mm,
mean, that's really, really good. It's so strong. And again, you know, he when you read it aloud, you might miss the fact that, you know, if you look at this on, you know, on paper, it's very regular. It's, you know, stanzas of 4 lines, alternating rhymes. You know, the first stanza is stayed, till, frayed, sill. But when you read it aloud, there's such subtlety and complexity, and the fact that he includes voices as well. This was Mr. Bleeny's room. He stayed the whole time he was at the bodies till they moved him.
mm,
Flowered curtains, thin and frayed, fall to within 5 inches of the sill. So the rhymes are very, very regular, but you almost don't notice them, because of what he's doing. But it has this wonderful effect. I think the rhymes are still there, working on you. They're sort of, they act almost subconsciously, and they provide sort of structure and accentuation to the poems. But yeah, it's just remarkable. I mean,
absolute master.
everybody needs to read Laurate. I mean, the man was a genius. And it's really interesting though. Again, you know, you shouldn't. Of course, Larkin was gifted, to use an ugly term. But he worked very, very hard to achieve what he did. When I was in London recently, I was just strolling along, and I walked into a bookshop, and I was shown some very interesting things by the bookseller, actually, you know, because I was the only person in there. And he showed a copy of Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, which was from during the war years, the rationing years.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting is the cover. The inside, you know, it looked like a standard edition, but then on the inside of the cover was actually a reused soldier's map, you know, like a map of Germany
That's
with, you know,
wonderful.
military positions and outposts or whatever, because they were reusing paper. But anyway, in there they had a second edition of an unauthorized edition of Larkin's The North Ship. The North Ship was his first collection, and it was
Yeah.
published by the Fortune Press. Which is a very funny story.
Yeah.
Essentially, they
Well,
published sort of
they were
smut and
pornography
pornography.
publishers, weren't they?
Yeah, and they needed sort of, you know, fluff to provide cover for their real business, and so they published Larkin's first collection when he was, what, I don't know, 23, 24ish, 25, maybe younger actually. And you know, you read that stuff, and a lot of it is very sort of, it's like a sort of young man trying to write like Yeats. And you know, you have lines like, you know, a drum beats a wintry drum, which is a bit, you know, it's a bit cloying and it makes you cringe. But you know, I'm just trying to find, because I have the collected works in front of me. There is one in this, and it's really interesting, where the sort of Larkin voice that we all know that you get in Mr. Bleeny and Obad, which we've seen there, shines through. And it's one on the moon. I'm just going to see if I can find it, because it's really interesting. It's like a sort of hint of what we're going to get later on, and it's short, so you can tell that, as opposed to the long sort of Yeatsian pseudo ballad things that he did write, or
Mm,
make up the majority of the collection. It was just you know, a short one. Let me see if I can find it. Sorry, I'm using
sorry.
Google
Well,
now.
he started off very much in debt to Yeats, and I think he kind of disowned that later on because he much more in debt to Hardy.
Mm.
Um,
Well, because he said again in that interview, where it's very surprisingly in depth for being so short. He says, you know, I was writing this sort of Yeatsian stuff until I was 27, and it was good in the sense that, you know, metrically whatever, but it
mm,
bore no relation to the life I was living. And you know, I think you can take that sentiment too far. Poetry shouldn't just be a sort of kind of naturalism, in the old
no,
sense of that term. It's a recreation, of life as you see it. But it can be more than that as well, and it should be more than that. Where is this thing? All right, I think I'm getting close. Um, Bugger. I'm so bad with computers. I think if you're a poet, you have to be terrible. All right, here it is.
you have to be.
Okay,
The
so
Notebook
this
is
is this is from the first collection, and you do get the Larkin-esque voice. Okay, um, the moon is full tonight and hurts the eyes. It is so definite and bright. What if it has drawn up all quietness and certitude of worth, wherewith to fill its cup? or mint a second moon, a paradise, for they are gone from earth. And I think, there are some lines in there which read in a sort of archaic, perhaps modern, perhaps pre-Raphaelite way of, sort of certitude of worth wherewith to fill its cup. Again, very well done, because you have that assonance of certitude of worth wherewith to fill its cup. That's very good. But I think those first three lines are very Larkin-esque. The moon is full tonight and hurts the eyes. It is so definite and bright. Definite and bright. It's very simple, very pared down, but it's very effective. And I do think that is a hint of what we would get later on. Anyway.
Oh, I mean, just an absolute master. Really, still underrated. Not really, because I think with Larkin, his aesthetic, and I'm not just talking about the verse, but the whole aesthetic of the world he lived in, him as a kind of character, and his writing, they all come together so well into that really dreary. In fact, there's a wonderful Hitchens essay about Larkin, Christopher Hitchens, where he talks about.
Yeah, it's a good essay.
And there's a paragraph where he talks about the England that Larkin was from. I know we're a bit pressed for time, but I need to find it now. I'll just
but if I just cut out randomly, it's because this thing is died. It's not because I just left.
Right, I'm just gonna get that. Sorry. But yeah, there's a paragraph where he just so perfectly sums up the world they came from, and that type of England, which I just have to dodge a paywall because it's the internet, and the internet is disgusting. Here we go. So I now wish I had understood enough to push my earlier comparison a little further, for there is another aspect of Englishness, netted in discrepant ways by Harold Pinter and Monty Python, in which both men had a share. This is the world of wretched, tasteless food and watery drinks, dreary and crowded lodgings, outrageous plumbing, surly cynicism, long queues, shocking hygiene, and dismal, rain-lashed holidays, continually punctuated by rudeness and philistinism. I love because he's so right in that. But I mean, one of the things that winds me up again about the kind of the dissident right in Britain, especially, is the kind of fetishization, the overdue fetishization, get through it, of kind of like hobbitism and provincialism, where they kind of in reaction against everything that's happening, they insist on only seeing that one particular aspect of the English coin, as it were, when there's so much more to it. I mean, I think it's the responsible man, the intelligent man, has to take everything as a whole. You have to acknowledge all the different facets of things, and I mean that to me sums up that aspect of England. It's being stuck on a crowded train going through Prestatyn at 4:00 in the afternoon. It's not everything that I think Britain is authentically is a kind of Lindy picture of some green fields and the pub. There is so much more to it than that.
I mean, there's more to culture than being a sort of extension of the national trust.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, sort of salivating over a ruined cotton mill somewhere, or and again, it's annoying because certain people who I admire very much, very talented, educated people like Tolkien, right? To talk about hobbits. I mean, of course, can't knock Tolkien. I mean,
no.
I think some of the Lord of the Rings is a bit dry, personally, but you must respect the man. The problem is, I mean, there are these people now who sort of base their whole world view and their whole personality, their whole life around sort of this writer of, I guess, fairy tales or whatever you want to call it, and that's just not right.
No.
Culture isn't this sort of myopic thing where you latch onto a few figures. I mean, culture is the canon, right? It's there. You can debate with a writer like Tolkien or most recent writers, are they part of the canon? I would argue they probably is. but that stuff is there. It's there for you. Don't pigeonhole yourself with this twee stuff. It's not that it's
No,
bad,
it's
but
it's mind rotting as well. It
yeah,
keeps you trapped in a
yeah,
particular
and
place. I mean,
I mean, what are you gonna do? You're gonna turn around and say, and the funny thing is, like, I can understand it if you were some sort of farmer type from Somerset. You're like, oh no, that
no, but
Ellie,
it's
no, no,
but it
no,
isn't. But
that's
it
what
isn't
these
because
guys
it's
are.
a kind of bourgeois parody of that. It's the
Yeah.
biscuit tin version of that.
You know what it
Um,
reminds me of? You know what it reminds me of?
go on.
All this stuff. And also, the Americans are particularly bad. You have these guys who were making six figures in some corporate job, and they move and buy a farm somewhere, right? And in reality,
Mhm.
they're running the thing into the ground. They've got all this sort of luxury equipment. They've got all these luxuries in the house, like a hot tub on the patio, etc.
Yeah,
That is essentially the modern equivalent of the Roman aristocrat, right? Someone, who buys some villa somewhere outside of Rome, a retreat from the city, from his busy schedule as a lawyer or whatever. He takes with him a copy of Columela's De Re Rustica, and he decides, all right, I've lived in Rome my entire life. I've been attended on hand and foot by slaves, but now I'm a proper old school Roman citizen farmer, and this was very, very common, and it was sort of fashionable, and because a lot of Romans had these, you have these guys called like Chad Hanks or something, even though he actually went to Harvard. And they, all these Romans, they had names like like Lentulus or Cicero, which are the kinds of beans, basically.
yeah,
It's crops like rustic
and
Cincinnatus
I mean,
farmers. But then if we actually look at the villas that these guys were staying in, it's got like 100 bloody rooms, slave quarters, a
mm,
hot tub again. They didn't do any of the work themselves. They would even in Roman villas have a shop attached to the place, just like today with bloody Clarkson's farm, where he has his little farm shop where he sells his little produce. The Romans did this 2,000 years ago. It's the exact same thing. It's this sort of,
yeah.
like you say, this bourgeois rusticity. And it only comes when things are getting really, really precarious as well, I think.
And I mean, I'd like to point out. I mean, I live in rural Wales, so I mean, I'm not. I mean, I don't have any objection, and I deeply adore the countryside. I love going to the pub. I love all this. But the
As
thing
do
is,
I.
it's
I,
what. But
I was a fisherman in my youth.
But it's one aspect. It's one aspect
Yeah.
of life in this country and authentic culture in this country. I mean, I have the same joy here as when I sometimes visit London and step into Paddington Station, even though it's horribly full of foreigners and all kinds of horrible aspects of modernity. I still
Yeah, like
feel
when we
kind
were on
of
our way, like when we were on our way to go and see a play, and we're on the tube and we're drinking whiskey and doing impersonations of Japanese people in the middle of the tube.
well, I mean,
I mean that's yeah,
there's just different ways of living, and I mean, you should really be able to get a grip of all of it because I mean,
art
it
being
is
cultured.
when I look at the great grand Victorian kind of imperial hallmarks that you have in a place like London, even now, that to me is still just as heartwarming and still just as authentic as the local pub here in Wales is, even though they may as well be from different planets, but they're still part of the same thing. And I don't like the kind of fetishization of one particular aspect of it.
Yeah,
Um,
hemming
yeah,
yourselves in for no reason.
don't do it. Be worldly without being cosmopolitan. That's my
Mm,
advice to
yeah.
people. I mean, don't think of like Klaus Schwab in his jet going to Switzerland.
No,
Think of Byron going to Greece
yeah,
or going to Armenia. To kind of become educated and to have a sense of the known world. That's the
which is
right
why I'm
attitude.
fucking off to the south of France next time,
We'll have
never
to.
to
Can we
return.
both? Right. So if I'm going to Rome, you're going to the south of France. Can we both write humorous travelogues and
Yes,
compare them?
that sounds fun. Yes, I'd
Yeah.
like that.
And then we can fight over whose was better in the street or something.
Naturally. Yeah. Well, shall we
Should
retire?
we adjourn for the night?
I think
Yeah.
so. Yes, my laptop is going to die. So we
Yes.
must be very
I can
brief.
hear the doo-doo.
Yeah. But it's been a pleasure as always. It's been really fun.
Indeed,
Uh,
indeed. It's very, very good to have you here. It is very good to talk to someone with serious ideas about this sort of thing.
yeah.
So
Buy
you,
book. Buy
yes,
book. If
yes.
you're
Buy his
listening,
book.
buy my
Buy his
book.
book.
I need bread, please.
Even poets have to eat.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
Well, yes, and there will be more stuff on Twitter about this projected poetry reading.
Oh, it's
Once
going to be so
I'm
fun.
back from the continent,
We've
definitely,
we've
and
got
you
we've
will
got to
come.
get
I will
we've
drag
got to
you
get
along.
Pharaoh. We've got to get him to make some
Get
giant like
everyone.
wall
Get
art.
everyone. Yeah. Dancing girls, you know. Yeah.
couple of tarts. No, I'm joking.
Couple
No.
tarts. It's London. They're around. You know.
Oh,
Tarts just sort of accumulate, don't they?
yeah,
They
that's
just
true.
come.
That's true. We'll see what
All right.
interesting
Well,
specimens turn up.
until next time.
Indeed. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay.
Blessed Sunday, and
All right.
see
Yes.
you next time.
Oh yeah, it's Sunday. Oh goodness.
Go to
Thanks,
church.
everyone.
Too late. Anyway. All right. Bye.